Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Explosions heard across Ukraine this morning as Vladimir Putin authorises a special military operation in the country.
Morning to you. It's 6 o'clock on the 24th of February. This is Breakfast on GB News with Stephen and Isabel. The news you're waking up to this morning are multiple reports of explosions in Ukraine as Russia launches an invasion. The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says his country will defend itself.
Well, in the past few hours, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has stated that Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and is discussing next steps with the Ukrainian President Zelensky.
And President Biden has also made a statement tweeting that the prayers of the world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. We'll bring you the very latest.
And let us know your reaction this morning to the fast-moving events in Ukraine. You can get in touch on email gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews.
So the breaking news this morning is that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched an invasion of Ukraine.
Mr. Putin threatened that international attempts to interfere with Russian action will lead to consequences never seen.
Well, his announcement came as the UN Security Council called for peace. The Ukrainian government has confirmed that a full-scale invasion has begun. Ukraine's Interior Ministry has also confirmed reports of explosions in the capital, Kiev. Worth pointing out as well that the Ukraine military is now saying, according to Reuters, that 5 Russian planes and 1 Russian helicopter have been shot down in the Luhansk region. That's in the eastern part of Ukraine. And this is the situation in Kiev at the moment this morning. This is Maidan Square in the centre of Kiev, where you can see, a fair amount of traffic. It almost seems like life is continuing as normal, but we know from the reports that certainly in some parts of the capital, that is certainly not the case.
Yeah, a state of emergency has been declared in Ukraine. In fact, martial law has now been put in place and Ukrainians have been urged to stay at home, although as you can see from that picture, people are still moving around the capital. But air raid sirens have been heard this morning, not only in Kiev, but in Kharkiv as well, with reports of explosions being heard there. Well, in the past couple of hours, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has put out this tweet. He says, "I am appalled by the horrific events in Ukraine. I've spoken to President Zelensky to discuss next steps. President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and destruction by launching this unprovoked attack on Ukraine." He goes on to say the UK and our allies will respond decisively. We will wait to see what exactly he means by that. Will there be further sanctions announced this morning?
Well, President Biden has taken to Twitter as well, saying the prayers of the world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. President Putin, he says, has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering.
And the latest from President Biden, he's tweeted in the last few moments saying this time, President Zelensky has reached out to me tonight and we've just finished speaking. I condemned this unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. I've briefed him on the steps we're taking to rally international condemnation, including tonight at the UN Security Council.
Just want to bring you the latest that we're getting from Poland, and a Polish government spokesman has said that now is the time to reinforce NATO's eastern flank, and saying we expect such decisions to be taken. It's worth pointing out, of course, that certainly UK troops have been deployed over the last few weeks, or reinforcing numbers in Poland, also Estonia and other Baltic states, because obviously there is a concern that will those countries neighbouring Russia, now be the NATO countries at least, be under further threat?
Well, yesterday, President Zelensky gave a 10-minute address urging Russia to pull back. He said it was unlikely that ordinary Russians would hear what he was saying because of the disinformation campaign being put out by the Kremlin. And it is now not only a matter of tanks and boots on the ground in Ukraine, but a war of words as well. In the last few moments, Russia has denied those reports from the Ukrainian Interior Ministry of that Russian aircraft being downed over Ukraine. So as you can see, it is going to be quite difficult, really, to establish the facts throughout the course of the morning, with Russia putting out false information all the time, alleging yesterday that there was a genocide underway in those two disputed areas of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Well, look, while President Putin was announcing that military operation, an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council was taking place, and the UK ambassador to the UN warned that the Prime Minister will not compromise in ratcheting up sanctions against Russia.
Russia has been holding a gun to Ukraine's head. Now, President Putin's finger is on the trigger. Make no mistake, the UK will not compromise. And we will ratchet up economic consequences should Russia continue its aggression. There is still time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. But that time is now.
Well, the US ambassador to the United Nations said this.
The exact time as we are gathered in the council seeking peace, Putin delivered a message of war in total disdain for the responsibility of this council. This is a grave emergency. The council will need to act, and we will put a resolution on the table tomorrow. As President Biden said tonight, Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and our allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable.
We're just hearing that the military infrastructure of Ukraine's air bases has been neutralised. That's according to the Russian Defence Ministry, being quoted by the Interfax news agency, the Russian news agency. The Ukrainian president saying we are building an anti-Putin coalition in all of this. I mean, it is moving very, very quickly. But I mean, to hear that Ukraine is claiming they've shot down 5 Russian planes and a helicopter, and maybe in direct response to that, we're then hearing that the Ukrainian airbase infrastructure has now been neutralised, according to the Russian Defence Ministry. So it is all happening very quickly. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN confronted Russia's ambassador, stating that the Kremlin has declared war on Ukraine.
The ambassador of the Russian Federation 3 minutes ago confirmed that his president declared a war on my country. So now I would like to ask the ambassador of the Russian Federation to say on the record that at this very moment, your troops do not shell and bomb Ukrainian cities. Because it's too late, my dear colleagues, to speak about de-escalation. Too late. The Russian president declared a war.
I've already said all I know at this point. Waking up Minister Lavrov at this time is not something I plan to do. This isn't called a war. This is called a special military operation in the Donbass.
Well, let's get some analysis now of this developing and breaking story for you this morning. Defence analyst and author Tim Marshall joins us on the line now. Good morning to you, Tim. Look, as we've been saying, this is a fast-paced development. It's been a long and sleepless night in Ukraine. And, well, the world's worst fears realised just before 3 o'clock UK time with a full-scale Russian invasion.
It's a classic military tactic. Just in the hours before dawn, you take out as much as you can of the infrastructure and then move up the infantry and the tanks, which is probably what is happening now. What we still can't get a clear picture of is the scale. I mean, it's big, but it's crucial to know, for example, has Odessa been invaded? That is a city on the Black Sea. If so, then it's even bigger than we first thought, because there would be no point in doing that if you weren't going to try and cut the whole Black Sea coast off, join it to Crimea, join that up to the Donbass. There's also, again, unconfirmed reports that the Russians are coming out of Belarus and down southwards. If all that's true, then they're going to take a huge chunk out of Ukraine. If it is just the Donbass region, it will be more limited, but it's still incredibly bloody. I do tend to believe the Russian reports that they've neutralized Ukraine's capacity to put planes up. I mean, there is just no competition between the two air forces, and if that's true, then they have complete air domination to move around almost at will. And we have to wait to see if the reports of up to 5 Russian jets being shot down are true. It does sound quite a lot, given the amount of firepower that the Ukrainians have to use.
But how do you see this on the international front, Tim? How do you see this developing today? I mean, the EU saying, "Oh, we're going to come up with a bigger package of sanctions and things." I mean, obviously that's just not going to make any difference now, is it?
No. I mean, you know, the time has passed. What they did with the sanctions, which were fairly substantial, was to say, look, this is going to hurt. Please don't go any further. But they have held things in reserve. So you're going to see absolute condemnation, left, right, and centre from around the world all day. This, of course, was priced in by Putin. It will not halt whatever his objectives are. They will still hold some sanctions back, because if you get to a scenario in a couple of days' time, if this is what they're going to do, and they're driving towards the capital and threatening the capital, the outside world still needs something short of a direct military intervention themselves to be able to say, as a pressure, as a stick with which to say to Moscow, do not take the capital, you know, halt now, otherwise we're going to do X, Y, and Z. For example, the SWIFT banking system, try to kick Russia out of that, although that will be problematic. I mean, France, for example, I think the $25 billion worth of debt are owed to French banks, and they would have no way of getting that money back if they kicked Russia out of the SWIFT international banking system. So all this stuff will play out, and I think an awful lot of it is predicated on when we get this picture of exactly what is it they're going for. Is it just to take the whole of the Donbass, or are they going to join the Donbass up to the Crimea, which means taking the whole Sea of Azov coast, and then all the way along to Odessa, which means taking the Black Sea coast? Because if they do that, they're cutting Ukraine off from the sea. They're making it essentially an agrarian-based economy, because the Donbass is the industrialized region. The Black Sea coastline is where all the trade comes in and out by sea. If they cut them off from all that, what you're left with is the wheat-growing area in the middle, and that's not really sustainable.
We're hearing in the last few moments that the Prime Minister is to chair a COBRA meeting at 7:30 this morning. This comes 2 days after the last emergency COBRA meeting, the last one having gone on for several hours, and an announcement of the first, as the Prime Minister described, barrage of sanctions was announced. So we can expect, one can presume from that, the latest developments, given what the Prime Minister has tweeted this morning, saying that the West and their allies will act swiftly in response to this.
Yeah, after COBRA, you will see more sanctions announced. It was fairly thin, the British sanctions announced, so there'll be whatever it is that they've held back. They will now ramp that up a bit, and I suspect we'll also see Britain agreeing with the other NATO countries that call for reinforcements on the borders. Poland has already called for an emergency meeting of different NATO countries today, and the British will be one of the ones that will back that and will probably back reinforcing NATO's borders.
What do you think the impact is going to be on the region? So you mentioned Poland. They're already calling for more NATO support, NATO security. We've had an ironclad guarantee from America that the NATO Article 5 will be upheld, so that if any NATO countries are attacked, obviously we will all respond there. But this is going to be destabilising to those states and particularly to the Baltic states as well, isn't it?
They are the most concerned. I mean, I don't see any sign at the moment of any immediate threat to NATO's borders, and NATO is a far more powerful military organization than is the Russian military. So that's not in the immediate future. But when you destabilize half of the continent in this manner, it shows you the degrees to which Putin will go, and he does have designs on the Baltic states. It would be a step too far to actually go in militarily, but there are so many other ways across the years that you can work to undermine a country, a small country. For example, Estonia, when you have a border with it and you're a giant country like Russia. So that's not going to stop. I think what we're seeing is a sort of iron curtain coming down again. In Europe and actually beyond, of authoritarian states. And because if you draw a line from the Baltic Sea, where Kaliningrad is, which is a Russian exclave, it's only about 30 miles across, and then you're into Belarus. And then you're down into Russia, and then you're into the Central Asian republics, leading all the way down to China. And there is this new sort of iron curtain that has come down between the progressive democratic countries and the authoritarian states, and this is just sort of sealed that line, if you like. It is quite a momentous occasion, even if Putin is not going to take half of Ukraine. And at the moment, we can't tell the scale of the invasion. It is widespread, but we can't see the aims yet because it's too early to see where the troops are and which directions they're heading. But regardless of that, a line has been drawn today.
Tim, I just want to ask, before we let you go for now anyway, just a sense of how much of a surprise this will have come as to ordinary Ukrainians. I mean, there's been war talk for weeks now, and yet the reports from people we've been speaking to in the country over the recent days is that there has been this sense of calm. We're seeing a live picture of Kiev now. We can still see cars out on the road, vans, buses, you name it, despite martial law being declared by President Zelensky and people being urged to stay at home. How much is this going to impact ordinary people at this stage? I mean, conscription's been introduced, isn't it? Reservists have been called up from 18 to 60-year-olds. Will people be preparing now as civilians for full-scale war?
Yes. And the calm that there was, and also, you'll remember over the past few weeks, a lot of Ukrainians, including the president, was saying, you're hyping this up. It's not going to happen. I think at the most senior levels, they knew this was probably going to happen, but they had to keep a sense of calm amongst the population. They also had to try to keep inward investment coming into Ukraine, which has collapsed. Why would you invest in Ukraine at the moment? So I think they were being a bit disingenuous, certainly at the leadership level. And I think in the ordinary public, they will be sort of shocked but not surprised, because I think in the last 48 hours, you could sense a mood change. They realised this now looks likely. I mean, I haven't been there for some time, so I don't know, but I would assume they would do what we would do. You'll have your grab bags. You'll have bags packed just in case. You will, if you think you're near a target, be heading to a bunker, depending on which of the cities you're in. I mean, you would not want to be in an apartment block close to an airport or close to a military base. So there will be an absolute sense of shock, and the families will be saying goodbye to their menfolk. It's 45 million people. They're conscripting the reservists, people that have done military service, aged between 18 and 60, which tells you that they plan to try to combat this, try to slow any advance. Whether they can, we will find out, and we'll find out just how far the Russians want to come. Is it just into the Donbass, or will they push all the way to the Dnieper River and even try and take the capital?
Tim, we're hearing that, and you'll be able to put this into some sort of context for us, that there's shelling in western Ukraine, in the Lviv region.
In western Ukraine, that's near the Polish border. Well, that I'm trying to assess that. That would probably be some form of military base. They perhaps are taking out radar or runways or command and control centers, and that would be airstrikes. They won't be shelling them. It's too far from the Russian border. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of miles. Again, at this distance, with that amount of information, I can only guess. I suspect that would be an airstrike on a military target, which is command and control. They are dismantling Ukraine's ability to put the air force up. They are trying to dismantle their ability to contact each other. I mean, it's classic. We will probably see cyber attacks today as well. But the first thing you do is you destroy the capacity of the enemy to communicate with each other, to sow chaos. So that is an initial reaction to that, because if you really mean the west of Ukraine, you're talking about towards the Polish or Romanian borders.
Okay, look, Tim, for now, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to bring you up to date with some of today's other news this morning. And as you've been hearing, the latest situation in Ukraine is that President Vladimir Putin has launched a special military operation. Ukraine's military says their country's air defence shot down a Russian plane in eastern Ukraine. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson will chair a Cobra meeting at 7:30 this morning, and we'll be bringing you all the details on this developing story throughout the morning.
Well, also today, almost 2 years down the line, and COVID laws in England come to an end today. It means people who test positive with the virus no longer legally have to isolate. Follows the Prime Minister's living with COVID strategy announcements on Monday, which also included getting rid of free universal testing in April.
The UK has pledged £160 million to speed up the development of vaccines against deadly diseases. The research project CEPI is on a mission to slash the time it takes to make a vaccine to 100 days. That is a third of the time it took to develop the first COVID jab.
Credit card application fraud attempts surged at the fastest rate in 5 years in the last 3 months of 2021. The data from the Credit Reference Agency shows nearly 3/4 of detected cases involved fraudsters using the victim's current address to apply for credit.
Hidden salt in some types of soluble paracetamol has been linked to an increased risk of heart disease and death. The European Heart Journal found that heart problems are higher among those who use salt-containing paracetamol.
A new analysis shows the majority of pregnant women are still avoiding COVID-19 vaccines despite the risks. The charity Wellbeing of Women found that severe coronavirus infection in pregnancy significantly increases chance of stillbirth, premature birth, and risks to the mother's health.
stay with us. We're going to show you a weather forecast first, and then after that we'll be back to that developing situation in Ukraine, where President Putin has now launched what he calls a special military operation into the country. Stay with us.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your forecast. It's a cold day on Thursday. We've got snow and lightning across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and for all of us, some strong winds. Now, we've got this cold front continuing to clear its way southeastwards across the UK, so much of the country is in this blue air, cold air with strong winds, as you can see from these tightly packed isobars. So we've got some early rain clearing southern and eastern parts of England. Behind it, the colder air is sinking in, and that's where we've got the showers feeding in through the afternoon. Widely, we'll see some quite frequent snow showers across Scotland and Northern Ireland, 10 to 20 centimetres possible over the hills, combined with frequent lightning, so we have that weather warning in place. With the strong winds, we'll see blizzards over the mountains, so some really poor visibility at times. Elsewhere, plenty of sunny spells, but rattling through will be those heavy showers, some hail, some sleet and rain all in the mix, and it's a cold day. Now, we'll continue to see those showers through the first part of Thursday evening, pushing their way across the country, but tending to ease through the small hours of Friday as we start to see a ridge of high pressure in. So with clearing skies and the winds easing down, I suspect some places will have a bit of a frost as we start Friday morning. Temperatures 2s and 3s in our towns and cities, lower in the countryside. But it does mean where we have the frost in the morning, there will be a lot of sunshine around. Still a few wintry showers, perhaps down the spine of the Pennines over towards eastern England, but they should clear away. And then for most of us, it's a fine and bright afternoon with spells of sunshine, although the cloud does increase across the northwest later on with some outbreaks of rain into western Scotland. Temperatures for many places around where they should be for this stage in February, coming in around 10 or so across the south. And we keep the fine weather through much of Friday, but in towards the weekend, cloud will thicken further north. There is the chance of some rain, but it stays largely dry and bright with temperatures near normal towards the south. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
It is 6:27. Back now to our top story. We're joined in the studio by international security analyst Will Geddes. Really good to see you this morning. It's going to be interesting to get your take on what we're seeing at this stage, Will.
Yes, I mean, at the moment, we've got to be very cautious about what information is coming out of both Ukraine and Russia. Inevitably, always in these very early stages, you're going to get false reporting. some of which would be propaganda-based on both sides in terms of obviously not wanting to show that they are losing or they're losing ground for any matter. But certainly we're hearing that it's a three-prong attack which is coming in from Crimea, Belarus and from Russia on the Ukraine. They are taking the Donbass area, and that is very much the intention, as Putin has said. He wants to demilitarize that, whatever that means. However, what we're going to see from the Ukraine is obviously a degree of resistance. We're seeing people mass evacuating from Kiev, and I think the concern is that the end game will be to take Kiev.
Air raid sirens have been heard in the capital, Kiev, and reports overnight of shelling. A really worrying time. Martial law has now been declared in the country. Just to give people at home a sense of what that means in terms of civilians and you know, the advice to stay at home. Is that a legal requirement now?
Yes, very much so. Having been in a number of countries myself which have had martial law imposed, it's very frightening for the general citizens because they will be hearing the chaos outside, not only in terms of the indirect fires and possibly even gunfire, because we know that there's a lot of ballistic attacks which are going on right now, so there will be explosions going on across the country. But I think the fact that they realise that they cannot necessarily escape. The military has taken control of the streets. And there are very good benefits for this. Obviously, it's to reduce the chances of potential mass casualties. But at the same time, if you feel trapped in that sort of environment and that sort of situation, it's pretty hairy, to put it mildly.
Is the international community able to do anything at this stage? Because we are constantly told we're not putting boots on the ground, we're not going to start shooting the Russians. So unless we do that, is there anything realistically that we can do? Yes,
It's a really good question. At the moment, we do have troops actually in Ukraine at the moment. The question is, however, what are their rules of engagement? Are they to participate? Are they to collaborate with the Ukrainian forces? Because if they do, we already know from Putin's statements that if there's any retaliation by any other country, there will be serious consequences. And this was quite a chilling message that Putin sent out. We know that the government is meeting this morning for a COBRA meeting, an emergency COBRA meeting. What we're going to see potentially is a ramping up of these sanctions. How they're going to ramp them up and what difference that's going to make is very questionable, because when we consider that Russia has become quite insular and quite self-sustaining, they may not really worry that much.
In terms of our troops in Ukraine, then, what are they doing? I mean, likely sort of looking at helping with evacuation procedures, those sort of issues?
Well, may or may not be. You know, they've been down in an advisory role in many capacities, trying to provide training for local Ukrainian troops. 200,000 reservists within Ukraine, and that is Ukraine nationals, have been called up to respond to this situation. I think there's every good chance that other than perhaps special operations units, the others will want to take a somewhat passive stance, because, again, that could be seen as collaborating with Ukraine and, again, draw on those consequences. And I think that's something they're going to discuss at COBRA this morning.
And so, Will Geddes, is it really your view at this stage that diplomacy is dead? I mean, the UN Security Council had an emergency meeting overnight, condemning everything that's happened, but we're seeing no face-to-face talks happening, quite rightly, I suppose, given what's happened. And yet, the message is supposed to be that that diplomatic door is still open. We could still pull back. But, it doesn't seem as though Putin will respond to that.
Yeah, that's a question which I think is very difficult to answer right now. I certainly wouldn't have the answer myself on that. I think certainly in terms of the world economies and in terms of the financial impositions that would be made through these sanctions, the potential is to push the Russian economy down to a sort of Iranian level. We know that the Moscow Stock Exchange has now been closed whilst these actions are taking place. So at the moment, it's whether that diplomacy will have any difference, but that will only come from how robust and what sort of defence and support we are going to be offering publicly to Ukraine to try and resist them.
What do you think the strategy is here, the Putin strategy? Is he looking for something short and sharp here or not?
No, I don't think so, Steve. I think, I met with some very, very, very smart people the other day. We were discussing this situation and they came from various different scopes within my world. The feeling is, Putin, this is just the start. I think one of the analogies which was used, which I thought kind of summed it up, was to say, if you imagine that the chair you're sitting on is Ukraine, what Putin is going to do is remove all the other furniture in the room while everyone's focus is there.
I want to get your view on, if we're talking about strategy and whether or not this is occupation or regime change. But in the short term, I suppose it'd be interesting to see whether Putin goes after things like munitions factories, infrastructure, airports. I mean, we've seen reports this morning of infrastructure being targeted in western Ukraine along the Polish border, which is, a real threat then to NATO countries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And also control of Odessa and any ports, including airports and seaports. That what Putin will want to do is quite normal in the invasion of any kind of country, to take out communications, to take out infrastructure, to basically disable that entire country's ability to be able to function in a normal sense. Where I think we've got to watch what is going to happen is that Putin can retaliate on a number of different platforms, whether that be in other regions, certainly in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans, whether it be by data cables undersea, because we know there's been a huge spike in submarine activity by Russia, whether it be by cyber attacks. So this is a multi-platformed offensive.
Well, I mean, the Ukrainian authorities are saying this morning that the cyber attacks are non-stop, to quote them. I mean, is there a danger of that escalating as well to other countries and to countries like us in the United States?
That is the threat, yes. Primarily that is the threat to anybody else who retaliates, and I think that's what Putin was fundamentally sort of insinuating within his statement about any retaliation will have consequences.
So to people waking up at home this morning to the worst possible news, and for anyone tuning in on radio or TV this morning, the breaking story is, of course, that Russia has invaded Ukraine around 3 a.m. UK time. What does this mean for us at home? I mean, we've discussed the fact that we're not going to be putting any more boots on the ground, as it were, into Ukraine. We've discussed the fact that we expect further sanctions to be made and we expect to see, energy prices going up. But, should people be worried about their actual security, their actual, could there be attacks here in the UK, for example, albeit cyber, or could it be chemical or even nuclear?
I think that of the latter, less so. I think there's probably little chance of that in my estimation. I'm always very cautious not to say robustly no to anything. But I think the cyber aspect is something that we need to concern about, certainly in the foreseeable weeks. I think what Prime Minister Johnson says today after the Cobra meeting is going to be key. I think what President Biden says after his conference at lunchtime today will give us a better idea, from an analysis point of view, as to what are the implications of risk and threat to the rest of us.
Well, yeah, and what is the threat at the moment to the NATO border? Yeah, I mean, Poland's already calling for NATO to make sure that the borders are secure. Is that a real risk at the moment?
I think it is. I don't want to be a real, doom.
Yeah, but if that happened, then there's a NATO alliance Article 5, isn't there, which is I think it's only been enacted once before.
Yes.
Which is if a NATO country is attacked, everyone responds. All the NATO countries respond. Well, then you're looking at World War III, aren't you?
It has the potential, again, without wishing to sound too negative.
Well, this is the problem. It all sounds extremely dramatic. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It is concerning, but when we bear in mind that the Danes have also moved their tanks up onto their borders, we have this forward presence initiative, which is where NATO and the UK have obviously delivered troops to countries like Estonia, Lithuania. It's as to what the macro story is of what Putin's strategy is, not the micro in terms of Ukraine. It's about what is the bigger picture that he's looking to achieve. He has been doing things by stealth for some time. Belarus is a great example where he brought his troops in to do training and has left them there.
Yeah. You do, I mean, you almost, as we look at this particular region, you almost forget about, as you say, Danish borders, Finnish borders.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, Finland, where there's a tremendous amount of history there.
Exactly. The whole Scandinavian area, Sweden and Norway, Finland, they are concerned. And particularly, I've been right up toward the Russian border in Finland, and it's a very porous border. It's very weak. And, inevitably, they're kind of concerned as well as to what is going to happen right now. So it's a watching brief to see what happens in Ukraine, but very importantly, what our world leaders basically are going to say.
Well, we'll get us. I know you're going to stay with us throughout the course of the morning for full analysis. We're very grateful for that. If you are tuning in this morning, we're going to take a quick break. Then we'll be back and go through the morning newspapers today with Dawn Neeson and David Wooding. Don't go anywhere.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
.40, let's go through the papers and actually get full analysis of what's going on today with former editor of the Daily Star, Dawn Neeson, and political editor for The Sun on Sunday, David Wooding. Good to see you both this morning. Look, David, what do you make of this? I mean, it's what was predicted, but of course it's the last thing any of us wanted to hear.
Yes, and you always, when these situations arise, hope against hope that perhaps he's bluffing and it won't happen. And there were some calls yesterday for the sanctions to be tougher when that first incursion went in the Donetsk region. And people were saying, well, was Boris Johnson tough enough? And I think we now understand why. I think he probably knew that there was more going to happen today through our intelligence services and was ready to clobber him with the full lot today.
It's not going to make any difference, though, is it, according to our guests?
No, the problem is there's only so much you can do without getting involved militarily yourself. And obviously they'll be seizing assets, I guess, and restricting travel of senior Russian people and stopping them transferring money and so forth, but there's not much more they can do.
Well, look, given the fast pace of the story, a lot of the papers, quite frankly, out of date on those latest developments. But let's reflect, shall we, Dawn, on what the Mirror have been reporting, Welcome to Hell. And this is talking about the conscriptions. 45 million citizens in Ukraine. Tim Marshall this morning saying to us that people this morning will be waking up and saying goodbye to their menfolk.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic description in the Mirror today. They have Andy Lyons, who's actually out there in Kiev, and I also have putting a personal spin on this because you wake up this morning, as Dave said, and you can't quite believe where you are. It all even though it hasn't escalated that fast in reality, it seems to have literally just blown up in our faces overnight. No pun intended, obviously. But I put on a personal level. I've got a friend who is a hairdresser in the capital city in Ukraine. And she was working and living over here with her family last year. And she messaged me this morning and she cannot believe that 1 minute she's in London and the next she's experiencing hell, basically.
Martial law.
Martial law. But the interesting thing, Isabel, she said this morning, she goes that, I got up and I went to work as normal because I thought I was just going to go and open the salon and the traffic was going normally in the streets and it was just really normal. And she didn't hear an explosion, but then she heard the siren go off and obviously go back home and don't leave everything. But she goes, the people there at the moment are just very calm about the situation. But some of the language in the papers I do find particularly the rhetoric is really ramping up, isn't it? I mean, the Mirror today, they've got a local MP sort of like, you're going to warning the Russians that you're going to die like lousy dogs, and it's the language instantly is scary. So if you're waking up this morning, it's really worrying news.
Yeah, I mean, the sound of an air raid siren in 2022 in an unprovoked attack.
Yes.
I mean, it's so evocative, isn't it, of
Very
the
much
Second
so.
World War?
Yeah, especially as just 12 months ago, you were working as a hairdresser in the central London.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
We're not, obviously, somebody was saying the other day, this is the worst crisis we've had since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of course, that was slightly different in that the Russians turned back then when they were bringing the missiles over to Cuba, but they're clearly pressing ahead with a full-scale invasion here.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, because whatever happens over there, there is a global impact in all of this, whether it's the markets or, fuel prices, obviously going to affect us over here directly as well. Just hearing, David, that European stock futures have plunged 4% already. I mean, and the Asian markets have taken a big tumble as well. So we're going to, the Independent reflecting on some of this, but it's going to be something we're going to feel now.
Yes, and I think probably the Prime Minister should start, and the Chancellor, laying the ground here for what's to come, because even if we don't get involved militarily, you've got real problems financially.
You've got to hope we don't get involved
Yes.
militarily, don't you? Because that's if that happens, then that opens up a whole new can of worms, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, either it does or it doesn't. I think it is up for discussion, certainly, because if you don't respond militarily, are you basically saying it's OK for a country to invade another country in an unprovoked attack? And does it give China, for example, permission to do the same in Taiwan and act with impunity?
Well, Boris Johnson said this in his speech in Munich at the Security Conference on Saturday, when he said that the shockwaves would be felt as far away as Taiwan. And I think he actually used Taiwan deliberately. But back to the cost of living here. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Fuel prices rise and energy prices rising beyond prices we've seen in the past, and this is just going to exacerbate it totally.
What do you think the government can mitigate that? Or will mitigate that?
It's very difficult. I think what they'll have to do is say, look, we're going to have to dig in here. It's going to be a tough old time, and this is going to send things a little bit higher. They're already trying to mitigate the prices that are going up because of rising cost of energy to begin with. This will make the cost of energy rocket even more. Now, why we don't rely on Russian gas as much as some of the EU countries, I think we're at about 15 or something like that percent.
3%.
Yeah,
3%.
Yeah, it's as low as that. There's those liquid gases which take it up to about early teens. But while we don't rely on it in that level, the knock-on effect of the gas prices will go through the industry.
Yeah.
And so devastating news then for Ukraine, but has an impact on all of us, those of us here as well, very worried about what it will mean in terms of us and our lives.
Well, very much so. I mean, as much as you're tempted this morning, if you're, putting on the news and listening to this horrific news, to try and tune it out and concentrate on life over here, it is going to affect us all. I mean, for a start, Ukraine war, this is the front page of the Times today, and a few other papers have covered it, could drive 5 million people from their homes. That's a huge refugee crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen. Ukraine also produces 30% of the global wheat, along with Russia. So again, you have to question where we're going for, global hunger, with countries like Libya, Yemen, and Lebanon suffering even more than they are already. So it's going to affect all of us. And the UK has done less with sanctions than all the other EU countries and USA at the moment, and it's like, are sanctions going to be enough now, though?
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because we look at what the UK was talking about with sanctions, and yet it was clearly, I'm talking to the Foreign Secretary yesterday, an international coordinated effort there. So we were sort of working very much in partnership with everybody else.
But ours still seem to be like, 3 very rich Russians and 5 small banks. You feel like we need to be doing more than that. But, as you were just talking about, the whole actually sending the military in there and starting a land war. I mean, Ukraine has the 3rd largest army in the world after, ironically, Russia and France. But their air force is not as strong. So maybe it's air support that we need. I mean,
Well, the air bases in Ukraine have been targeted by the Russians already this morning. And as you say, it may have a big army, but it's half the size of Russians, and it certainly will need the support of NATO allies. The issue of sanctions, I mean, we heard from the Foreign Secretary yesterday, didn't we, on the programme, saying that they were waiting until a full-scale invasion happened before they released the next round. We know that a COBRA meeting is due to be chaired by the Prime Minister in about 40 minutes, and we can expect an update. Do you think then we need to go harder and faster? We've seen this morning the Moscow Stock Exchange, for example, has collapsed.
Yes.
It will start to hurt President Putin, won't it, financially?
I think it will. I mean, the problem we've got, Isabel, it's going to be global. It's going to hurt us all. But I think, if we want to avoid a land war, and I think in our heart, surely everybody does. I mean, like David, I covered the problems in Bosnia, and honestly, Isabel, when you see what actually goes on in a ground war, it is. You don't ever want to go there. It's horrific. The people in the Ukraine are leading ordinary lives, and when you see what war does on the ground to people, you don't want to go there. So we all need to do now. It has to be a global effort, though. Everything we can using financial sanctions to make Putin back down.
I mean, David, Prime Minister Sanchez in Spain has spoken in the last few minutes, talking about coordinated response within NATO in all of this. I mean, is that the only route we can go down now, in the sense that the only way we can combat a force as strong as Russia is to bring NATO together and respond to this?
Yes, and we need to show a united front here. One of the reasons that Putin has gone for this is because he senses weakness in the West. You've had chaos in the White House. You've got a weak president in there. Boris Johnson under trouble at home with his parties. COVID wrecking the economies around the country, and also, of course, the European Union with a coalition government in Germany and so forth. So it's a perfect storm for Putin to strike. We do need to recalibrate the Western defence system, really. They need to find a way of binding everybody together a bit better than they have been.
You think, though, in 2014, when we let Putin get away with what he did to Crimea, we didn't send a very strong message then. This is why we need to act now and act fast.
It's interesting, the German defence minister, just you talk about Germany, while they've said this is a drastic breach of international law, in the last few seconds has said it is never too late for dialogue. Well, yes. It's a fair point, but you just can't imagine
I'm
Putin
assuming he's not saying that from a border town in the Ukraine.
Well, Putin is not one for wanting to talk, is he? He's a strong man.
Well, we've tried everything. We've had flattery. We've had Macron going over, sitting at the end of that incredibly long table, talking to him. We've shouted at him. We've threatened him. We've cajoled him. We've been nice to him. None of it works. As Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, says in some of the papers this morning, Putin has gone tonto.
Yeah, I mean, a few people were saying that he'd misjudged his language yesterday, but, waking up this morning, perhaps he hadn't. The German Foreign Minister describing today as a day of infamy that will go down in history. And we're hearing in the last few moments from the Ukraine Interior Ministry that shelling across Ukraine has now killed one and wounded one in Brovary. That's in the Kiev region, so getting close to the capital now.
Getting very close, isn't it? I mean, it's the language that Putin is using as well. I mean, I know the first casualty of any war is the truth, and there is so much propaganda out there. But if we try to defend Ukraine as we should, Putin's saying the consequences will be greater than you've ever seen or ever faced.
Ominous threats.
And it sounds. I know it could be rhetoric, Isabel, but it's absolutely chilling.
Well, it's a nuclear power.
It's a nuclear power.
Well, plus, we're also talking about. We've got to think of our military families in this country,
of course,
as well, haven't we? Where if anything happened, we are talking about body bags coming back to the UK. That's the grim, harsh reality of all this. The more we get of it, if we do end up having some sort of land war, that's what we're looking at. It's horrific.
And there's a lot of fatigue on that front as well, Stephen. We've had 2 decades of wars with Afghanistan and Iraq, and the last thing anybody wants is to see their loved ones sent into another front line.
That's the thing. We talk a lot about the cost of what's going on in Ukraine, and actually we don't often talk about the defence spend in all of this, and the defence budget will naturally go up now that we'll be sending more weapons. who knows if we'll end up sending troops at some stage, but it means there's less money for things like the NHS and to tackle the cost of living crisis.
That's a good point, Isabel. Also, of course, do we end up with another Iron Curtain? Do we have troops stationed along the east of Europe? Because those countries, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, which were all part of the old Soviet bloc before, are now on that line. And do we have to fortify that region to stop him treading beyond?
Well, the German defence minister has just said our allies on the eastern flank of the alliance, of the NATO alliance, can rely on our full support. And so, as I said, Baltic states, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania. I mean, that could be a massive deployment for decades to come.
Could be like it was back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s before the Berlin.
And Stephen's right. We do already have our forces out there. We have troops out there, and you have to think of the families of those who are now actually thinking what is going to happen. And the Mirror, and I don't subscribe to this terrorising journalism, but the Mirror today is that 200,000 reservists have been called up in the UK, and Russia's ordered 45,000 body bags. This is not news you want if you've got military serving out there.
Yeah. Well, look, Reuters Witness this morning reporting in the last few moments an armoured column of tanks and APCs, which are armoured personnel carriers, have been seen travelling to the Mariupol direction. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Mariupol is on the coast in the south of the country. So that confirms the sort of three-pronged attack that we've been talking about this morning from Belarus, from the Donbass and from Crimea.
Region,
And, we've heard, haven't we, from President Zelensky that now civilians have been told they can take up arms in the country. I mean, we've seen these photographs in the papers in recent weeks of children with weapons. I mean, this is what we're talking about: old people, children, civilians.
Yeah, there were some middle-aged women I saw on one clip who were being taught with wooden knives how to attack a soldier.
Well, you don't want to mess with us middle-aged women.
No. But certainly, Boris Johnson, again in that speech, looking back, was quite prophetic when he was saying Russia would be bogged down for generations in a grim and nasty war, bloody war, and of course the Ukrainians won't give in. They're
determined to fight. They're very
guerrilla
very, very brave, very loyal people to their country. They are going to fight till the end. If that's what it takes.
Yeah. I mean, this is Putin's legacy, isn't it? I mean, he thinks it's going to give him a strong legacy. It may not be the legacy he was wanting.
Well, this is what I was curious about, Stephen, thinking about the psychology of where he is at the moment. And as the Daily Star said, Vlad's gone full tonto, so who understands what's going on in his mind? But he wants to go down in history as a great leader, as saving the fatherland. But he's risking destroying it.
OK, look, we must leave it there, but we'll catch up with you two a little bit later on for the very latest on the situation. We will bring you all the latest on what is happening in Ukraine, with Vladimir Putin launching that military operation in the eastern part of the country, and some concerns it's spreading further already. All the latest in a couple of minutes after the weather.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your forecast. It's a cold day on Thursday. We've got snow and lightning across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and for all of us, some strong winds. Now, we've got this cold front continuing to clear its way southeastwards across the UK, so much of the country is in this blue air, cold air with strong winds, as you can see from these tightly packed isobars. So we've got some early rain clearing southern and eastern parts of England. Behind it, the colder air is sinking in, and that's where we've got the showers feeding in through the afternoon. Widely, we'll see some quite frequent snow showers across Scotland and Northern Ireland, 10 to 20 centimetres possible over the hills, combined with frequent lightning, so we have that weather warning in place. With the strong winds, we'll see blizzards over the mountains, so some really poor visibility at times. Elsewhere, plenty of sunny spells, but rattling through will be those heavy showers, some hail, some sleet and rain all in the mix, and it's a cold day. Now, we'll continue to see those showers through the first part of Thursday evening, pushing their way across the country, but tending to ease through the small hours of Friday as we start to see a ridge of high pressure in. So with clearing skies and the winds easing down, I suspect some places will have a bit of a frost as we start Friday morning. Temperatures 2s and 3s in our towns and cities lower in the countryside. But it does mean where we have the frost in the morning, there will be a lot of sunshine around. Still a few wintry showers, perhaps down the spine of the Pennines over towards eastern England, but they should clear away. And then for most of us, it's a fine and bright afternoon with spells of sunshine, although the cloud does increase across the northwest later on with some outbreaks of rain into western Scotland. Temperatures for many places around where they should be for this stage in February, coming in around 10 or so across the south. And we keep the fine weather through much of Friday, but in towards the weekend, cloud will thicken further north. There is the chance of some rain, but it stays largely dry and bright with temperatures near normal towards the south. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Explosions heard across Ukraine this morning as Vladimir Putin authorises what they call a special military operation in the country.
Air raid sirens have been heard across the capital, Kiev, as air raid warnings can be heard for miles.
Well, it's 7 o'clock on the 24th of February. This is Breakfast on GB News with Stephen and Isabel. And the news you're waking up to today, and multiple reports of explosions in Ukraine, as Russia says the move was a response to threats from Ukraine itself. The Ukrainian President, Vladimir Zelensky, says his country will defend itself.
Well, meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has stated that President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and is discussing next steps with Ukrainian President Zelensky.
President Biden has tweeted that the prayers of the world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. We're going to bring you the very latest.
And don't forget, we want to hear from you this morning. Let us know your reaction to unfolding and fast-moving developments in Ukraine this morning. Email us at gbnews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. OK, our breaking news this morning, and for latest developments, we can speak now to Oleksiy Goncharenko, who is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and joins us now from Kiev. A very good morning to you. We've been hearing those air raid sirens this morning. I'm hoping we've got that contact there. Good morning to you.
I'm here.
We've been
it's
hearing
not
those.
Very good morning.
Unfortunately.
No, of course it isn't. Look, just give us a sense of the mood where you are, hearing sirens, hearing shelling. I mean, citizens being urged not to panic, but that must, I'm sure, be very difficult.
The situation is difficult. There is a big war. It's not some operation. It's not like Eastern part, like you guys heard a little part of your life. It's everywhere in the country. Kyiv was bombed. Odessa, it's in the southern part. Western part of Ukraine was bombed. Rockets, bombs. We don't have exact numbers, but we have many victims already. Just 40 minutes ago, there was an extraordinary meeting of the parliament, and we provided martial law in Ukraine. We will fight. We will defend our land. But I want to address through your media, and thank you for covering just the authorities and the West. We need very strong sanctions against Putin. We understand that you will not fight for us on our land, but you can do no-fly zone over Ukraine, because on the land we are strong enough to make the hell for Russian soldiers here and occupants. But in the air, they're using aircraft against civilians, and against civilians in 21st century in the middle of Europe. And I ask you, and not you certainly, but your authorities, to help us to provide non-fly zone, like it was done in Syria several years ago, and to stop Russian aircrafts using Ukrainian skies to kill Ukrainian civilians and bombing infrastructure. Also, I ask you real sanctions against Putin, not just some things against his friends. It's sorry, but it's nothing. We need SWIFT should be stopped with Russia. Russian economy should be stopped. It should be embargo and ban on Russian oil and gas. That will influence Putin. If not, he will go further, and it can finish with the Third World War. It will not stop in Ukraine. Just for your understanding of your viewers, Ukraine is a nuclear power stations. Ukraine is a pipelines and chemical factories. It can be a disaster for the whole planet. I'm not speaking even about humanitarian things, but disaster for the whole planet. And even in the UK, and even in the far parts of Europe, people will feel it. Millions of refugees who will run from what's happening. So that is the moment when West need to show that there is something more important than money, than dirty Russian money, dirty Russian gas, bloody Russian gas, bloody Russian oil, and that's what should be done. And it's here, it couldn't be any, there is no time to wait, to think, to consultate, to say deep concern. It's not the time.
Look, we hear what you're saying loud and clear. The Prime Minister here is to chair an emergency meeting at 7:30. He said this morning that the UK and our Western allies will respond decisively. So I'd imagine you can expect a strengthening of those sanctions. I'm interested to hear, though, that you're talking about sanctions and a military response, but you don't seem to think that there is any diplomacy to be had at this stage.
What diplomacy? Our president tried to reach Putin yesterday, the day before yesterday. All last 8 years, the war is on the place for 8 years, but it was a low-scale war. But now it is a full-scale war. He doesn't want to speak about anything. There is no diplomacy. He doesn't understand any diplomacy. It's a Hitler. It's in 1938 in Munich. Appeasement of aggressor, it doesn't work. The false peace, it doesn't work. The only thing that aggressor understands is the power, the strength. And once again, not just economical sanctions, some banks, something like this, it's nothing for them. Ban on Russian oil and gas, minus SWIFT, so that Russian financial system is blocked from the world's financial system. That's something that they will feel, and they will feel it, and this can influence them, nothing else.
Tell us a little bit about what it means for Ukrainians today when you've imposed martial law. I know that you've made it legal for civilians to take up arms, to bear arms, if they choose to do so. There are fears, of course, that there could be huge numbers of refugees fleeing the war. What's the latest you can tell us about that?
Yes, we have a law which now we have people in territorial defense that are thousands of people. And our army is fighting now, and we have already news about smashed Russian aircraft, tanks, vehicles which are attacking Ukraine. So yes, we will fight. Many people will take weapons in their hands. That will be a disaster because that we are not going to surrender, and we will fight. We are big and strong and nation with a dignity. But it is difficult. It is very much difficult because we're a peaceful nation. And I want to remind you that Ukraine is the only nation in human history which voluntarily gave up nuclear weapons in 1994. At 1994, Ukraine had the third biggest nuclear weapon arsenal in the world. If we would have it now, never Putin will invade us. But we gave up our weapon because the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia asked us and gave us guarantees that never will something like this happen. Never. And we gave up our weapons for the first and last time in human history. Tell me, what is the message to the whole world now? That non-proliferation of nuclear weapons? That there are some treaties and papers in the world which cost something? Oh, it's just a paper which costs nothing. What is the message to the world? So I just trying to tell you that it is not about Ukraine. It is much, much bigger story.
Claimed this morning that your air defences have been taken out by Russia. What have you heard about that?
That's true. They attacked our anti-aircraft systems throughout the whole country. Also, they attacked airports and airdromes, military and civilian, just to stop any operating, probably not to give a possibility to send us support by planes, humanitarian or military. Yes, that's true. That's from what they started.
So, I mean, I know you called for a no-fly zone over the country, but if that doesn't happen, that leaves you, despite the size of your army, which is substantial, that still leaves you extremely vulnerable, doesn't it?
We are extremely vulnerable. That's why I'm asking you, not you again, but the West, for the non-fly zone over Ukraine, because that is the weakest point for us, the weakest point.
What do you see happening over the next 24 hours, unless there is an immediate response? And even if there is an immediate response from the West, it's not going to slow President Putin down very quickly. I mean, what do you expect to see happen? Is Kiev going to become a deserted capital?
Many people are now leaving Kiev, that's true. I am here, my colleagues are here. Ukraine is not a decapitated country. We have authorities, legal, absolutely authorities, legitimate authorities, and I think that's important. So I am not leaving Kiev, my colleagues are not leaving Kiev, majority of them. We are here. What will be next, for me, it's hard to say. Now everything depends on the reaction of the West and also from our army forces, how strong will be our reply. That will decide how the situation will develop.
Said that you want these very, very strong sanctions. You don't expect Western countries to start fighting your war for you. But ultimately, would that be welcome? Would you welcome NATO forces on the ground?
Definitely. If NATO forces could enter Ukraine, that's the best possible option. But to say the truth, for the moment, I don't believe in this. But the skies, that's absolutely possible. Help us with the skies. But if ground forces of NATO in Ukraine now, that's a miracle, and that's something which can really help us. And you just need to understand, Putin in his speeches, he said not only about Ukraine, that he doesn't accept the fact that we exist. He also doesn't accept the fact that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia exist, that Poland exists. He wants not 1997, like he said, NATO, no. He wants 1991 or better 1989 with the Berlin Wall and Germany divided. Maybe for you it sounds now, oh, how it could be. But maybe it sounded to you also 2 months ago, oh, how it could be a big war in the middle of Europe with the rockets bombing megapolises. Kiev is 3 million people. Odessa is 1 million people. Kharkiv is 1.5 million people. And that's happening just now. So when we are saying that it is impossible, sorry, but nothing is impossible anymore.
Look, you've confirmed to us this morning that your air bases and infrastructure have been targeted by the Russians. We've been hearing reports of this three-pronged attack from Belarus, from the Donbass region and from Crimea. In fact, there's been this build-up of warships in the Black Sea and talk about amphibious assault ships. Are you able to give us an update on any of those reports?
Yes, we have several. Belarus is also involved in the war. Belarus is in de facto occupied. Lukashenko is a puppet regime of Putin. Lukashenko is not legitimate. He is a usurper and under total control of Putin. And de facto, Belarus is occupied, but without fight. Now he tries to occupy Ukraine, but Ukraine will fight. So from Belarus, we have attack. We have attack from Crimea. We have attack in Donbass, and we have attack from Russia, directly from Russia near Kharkiv. That's the ways on which we have the attack of ground forces.
OK, look, we really appreciate you talking to us this morning, Mr. Goncharenko. Stay safe, and we'll hopefully get an update from you a little bit later on. For now, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Security expert Will is in the studio. What did you make of that, Will?
Well, I disagree with absolutely everything that he said. And I mean, in terms of the sanctions, I mean, the only way that Putin could be pushed back, if NATO engages, this will be direct confrontation. And that will not go well. It will not go well at all, because Putin is far too strong, far too robust, far too proud and arrogant to potentially concede anything at this stage. The only way that we can really impact Putin is in his pocket. And to the economy. And, you know, to a certain extent, although he is a force unto himself, there is a general populace and consensus amongst the Russian population, certainly contacts that I've spoken to, who were opposed to any kind of military action. But they will stick behind their leader until such time as it starts hitting them directly.
You talk about the no-fly zone. I mean, how enforceable is that under these sort of circumstances?
Again, very, very difficult. I totally understand why a no-fly zone is absolutely essential across Ukraine, because I think, as we were mentioning earlier, the key thing that will always happen in the first stages of an incursion will be to take out ports, to take out, as we've seen in Odessa right now, take out airports, both civilian and also military, so that you are disabling their ability to take out their anti-air missiles as well, and their anti-air defences is also, and I would imagine from that's not only from surgical strikes, from ballistics, but I think also in terms of cyber attacks.
That would indicate, wouldn't it, that it would be NATO aircraft taking on Russia aircraft to enforce that, and then that opens up that whole other wound again, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and again, that's a very precarious decision to have to make. So, you know, to be honest, the world leaders are going to be between a rock and a hard place. But one would have hoped that behind all the very public rhetoric that was being extolled earlier in the Munich Security Conference, they will have had a strategy in place to say, at what point do we incur various different security measures, whether it be removing Russia from SWIFT? And I think, you know, the point that your previous guest said, removing them from SWIFT is going to put them in a very, very difficult economic spot. We know that President Xi is going to be working very much in coalition. I mean, we all predicted well before this happened that there was going to be no Russian action until the Winter Olympics had finished in China. And surprise, surprise, the day after, obviously, the final ceremony, we see, obviously, Putin doing his...
Look, just to explain to anyone who hasn't followed this as closely as perhaps we have, SWIFT is this messaging service equivalent, I suppose you could describe it, to WhatsApp for those in the financial industry. It would really hurt the Russian financial sector. We've seen the Moscow Stock Exchange closing down this morning, so that pinch is beginning to be felt in Russia as a result of Western sanctions. Just tell us a little bit about what will be going on in that Cobra meeting, due to take place in 50 minutes, chaired by our Prime Minister. He'll be, no doubt, getting briefings from our security intelligence and give us an insight into what that meeting will involve and what kind of things we can expect to hear afterwards.
Wow, there's a big question, Isabel. Let me see if I can answer that one. OK, I think first and foremost there's going to be an intelligence brief and military brief, obviously, to the Prime Minister. That will look at, in the first instance, our own state security, our own state protection. So we'll look at any particular activity, particularly things like submarines that we've mentioned earlier, any air actions and aviation actions by Russia. We know that they've been incurring into British airspace for quite some time and have been doing so for the last few years. So we'll be seeing whether there are any increases there. There will be a briefing from GCHQ from a cyber perspective. Has there been an increase on potential or attempted attacks on our infrastructure? Anything that could give us an indication that Putin is ramping up any actions against us. Now, what he will do, and this is only my speculation, if I was in the room, would be that you've got to measure what our responses are going to be and what the repercussions are going to be of it. So it's dropping that proverbial rock into the pool to see what the ripples will
Let's
look
talk
like.
about the elephant in the room. And Mr. Goncharenko raised it. He referred to Hitler.
Yes.
In all of this.
Yeah.
Which is very difficult. Is it a fair comparison?
I think it's got some very direct parallels, Steve. I think it's got some very, very direct parallels in terms of, and I think that the point that your guest made, which was something I was communicating in the last few days, is this is not just about Ukraine. This is about what Putin wants to try and achieve, about re-establishing the old Russian Republic. And this is why there's such a broader threat across the Balkans and the Baltic areas. So when we look at it from that perspective, yes, you can draw some direct.
I suppose the distinction with Hitler is at this stage anyway that the final solution, you know, the mass genocide that Hitler imposed. But as you say, those invasions that we saw from the Nazi perspective into Poland is what really has those Nazi echoes.
Well, it's a question of, Isabel, the high casualty count, and particularly innocent civilian casualty count, and how precise the strikes are. You know, we've seen incursions done before where it's been done in a very, very clever, very smart, very directed sense. From what we're hearing, and again, we've got to be so cautious about what's being reported right now, what's accurate, what's propaganda, but it would appear that there is already a very, very high civilian casualty count and fatality count. Now, if that is the case, then yes, Isabel, we can draw back to the fact that, yes, on a genocidal aspect, this could potentially have, you know, again, those implications.
Yeah, what are you hearing about what's happening in Odessa?
Well, again, mixed reports. One of the reports is there are amphibious attacks, because obviously it's a port. It has a population, it's a very, very key seaport for Ukraine. Again, one of the things that the Russians have been doing has been controlling the seas and the waterways around those channels. We've seen it where Ukrainian ships have been seized, where the crews have been held prisoner. Again, controlling the seaports, controlling the flow of supplies coming back into into Ukraine is very, very critical, because it's about resupply. So even if you've got military coming in, if you're doing evacuations, if you're removing the ability to be able to evacuate, and you only really have three options, and that's air, sea, or by land, then again, they're controlling the environment.
Interesting development, actually, from the Chinese Foreign Ministry in the last few moments on the Ukraine crisis, saying that the Russian forces in Ukraine do not constitute an invasion as described by some foreign media. Now, we've talked a lot this morning about what the consequences will be of the way the West responds to this in terms of China's look at Taiwan. That's a worrying and perhaps surprising comment from them.
That's, I would be, if I was in Taiwan, I would be very, very worried off the back of that statement. I think we can see, certainly very foreseeably, that we could see something similar happening in Taiwan. And I think the problem is President Xi and also Putin are in cahoots here, and they're supporting each other. And bearing in mind about this Nord Stream 2 and obviously cutting off the gas supply into Europe, really that doesn't make a great deal of difference to Russia. A vast majority of their gas export goes into Asia.
Yeah, actually, just on that line, it says a lot to me. It's not a breaking line, but the Chinese embassy in Ukraine has told its citizens in Ukraine to display Chinese flags on their vehicles. Now, what does that tell you?
That tells them that they are exempt from potential actions, doesn't it? I think it says enough.
Yeah. OK, Will, for now,
thank you.
We'll catch up with you a little bit later on. Let's have a look at, just briefly, some of the other headlines of the day. And almost 2 years down the line, COVID laws in England could come to an end today. It means people who test positive will no longer legally have to isolate. It follows the Prime Minister's Living with COVID strategy announcement on Monday, which also included getting rid of free universal testing on the 1st of April.
The UK has pledged £160 million to speed up the development of vaccines against deadly diseases. Research project CEPI is on a mission to slash the time it takes to make a vaccine to just 100 days. That's a third of the time it took to develop the first COVID jab.
Credit card application fraud attempts surged at the fastest rate in 5 years in the last 3 months of 2021. Data from a credit reference agency shows nearly 3/4 of detected cases involved fraudsters using the victim's current address to apply for credit.
Hidden salt in some types of soluble paracetamol has been linked to an increased risk of heart disease and death. The European Heart Journal found that heart problems are higher among those who use salt-containing paracetamol.
I just want to bring the latest line we're getting from Foreign Minister James Cleverly, who's just said in the last few minutes that the UK will be bringing forward an unprecedented, coordinated sanctions package in response to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And that coordination with the EU and with the United States is very important, but quite what it would involve, we don't know. But that unprecedented sanctions package, well, we'll bring you more details on that as and when we get it, but it could be significant.
Yeah, the Prime Minister is to chair an emergency COBRA meeting in around, 5 minutes' time. We'll be taking a quick break now and bring you your forecast, and then we'll have all the latest on this fast-moving story for you after that. See you in a moment.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your forecast. It's a cold day on Thursday. We've got snow and lightning across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and for all of us, some strong winds. Now, we've got this cold front continuing to clear its way southeastwards across the UK, so much of the country is in this blue air, cold air with strong winds, as you can see from these tightly packed isobars. So we've got some early rain clearing southern and eastern parts of England. Behind it, the colder air is sinking in, and that's where we've got the showers feeding in through the afternoon. Widely, we'll see some quite frequent snow showers across Scotland and Northern Ireland, 10 to 20 centimetres possible over the hills, combined with frequent lightning, so we have that weather warning in place. With the strong winds, we'll see blizzards over the mountains, so some really poor visibility at times. Elsewhere, plenty of sunny spells, but rattling through will be those heavy showers, some hail, some sleet and rain all in the mix, and it's a cold day. Now, we'll continue to see those showers through the first part of Thursday evening, pushing their way across the country, but tending to ease through the small hours of Friday as we start to see a ridge of high pressure in. So with clearing skies and the winds easing down, I suspect some places will have a bit of a frost as we start Friday morning. Temperatures 2s and 3s in our towns and cities, lower in the countryside. But it does mean where we have the frost in the morning, there will be a lot of sunshine around. Still a few wintry showers, perhaps down the spine of the Pennines over towards eastern England, but they should clear away. And then for most of us, it's a fine and bright afternoon with spells of sunshine, although the cloud does increase across the northwest later on with some outbreaks of rain into western Scotland. Temperatures for many places around where they should be for this stage in February, coming in around 10 or so across the south. And we keep the fine weather through much of Friday, but in towards the weekend, cloud will thicken further north. There is the chance of some rain, but it stays largely dry and bright with temperatures near normal towards the south. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
"7:27 morning to you." So the breaking news today is that that invasion of Ukraine has properly got underway. A real incursion has now started. Shelling, airstrikes, a lot of the air capability of Ukraine has been taken out. It's a three-pronged attack on Ukraine, causing huge international concern. Well, our political correspondent Tom Harwood is here, where we've got, in a couple of minutes, another Cobra meeting underway. I mean, huge concern here.
Indeed. The Prime Minister is chairing a Cobra meeting from 7:30 this morning, no doubt to make a decision on further sanctions. It's likely, although we don't have this confirmed, that there has been a high degree of coordination as well between London and Washington and Brussels, as we have seen over the previous few weeks. We know that Boris Johnson was woken in the early hours of this morning and spoke to Ukrainian President Zelensky as soon as this invasion started, 5 a.m. Ukrainian time, 3 a.m. UK time. We know that Biden has also spoken to Zelensky in the early hours of this morning. This is a serious and coordinated international response that we can expect rolling out through this morning and later today.
I mean, James Cleverly, the Foreign Office Minister, has said unprecedented sanctions will be unveiled, because we don't, at this stage, have any indication quite what that will mean.
We don't have an indication of the specifics, but we do know the general direction that Western sources have been saying they would like to see, and they involve cutting Russia out of the entire global financial system, having Russia unable to fund its debt in any European, British or American financial centre. Also, technology exports seems to be high on this agenda for cutting Russia off, particularly with regards to Britain and America. Cutting Russia off from accessing the highest and latest technology may well cripple that country further. And then, of course, there are further oligarchs to go after.
Yeah, I was going to say, on that export business, I mean, that is actually, a lot of that technology is used in the military. Isn't it? So, I mean, it would have a degrading effect on the Russian military quite quickly.
It certainly could do. Of course, the Russian military is very well stocked. We've been talking for weeks on weeks about how the military has been building up on the borders of Ukraine, not just in terms of personnel, in terms of tanks, in terms of artillery, but also in terms of field hospitals that have been constructed on the borders of Ukraine by the Russian military. So whilst sanctions may have a medium to long-term impact on what Russia can do, the short-term impact is more about signalling than about an immediate impact on the capability of the Russian armed forces.
Look, the sanctions that were announced after the last Cobra meeting 48 hours ago being widely met with a bit of disappointment, being described as tepid from across the board, even some grandees within the Conservative Party not that impressed. Presumably something a bit stronger will come out of today's Cobra. I just want to read out to our viewers and listeners the tweet Boris Johnson put out 2 hours ago, so 5:30 in the morning. He said, "I'm appalled by the horrific events in Ukraine. I've spoken to President Zelensky to discuss next steps." He said President Putin has chosen a path of bloodshed and destruction by launching this unprovoked attack, and I think that's absolutely key, on Ukraine. He says the UK and our allies will respond, and he says, and I quote, decisively. That won't mean, and we can't expect, can we, to see boots on the ground anytime soon?
I think that is highly unlikely. Of course, that would be the beginning of a hot war between East and West, between NATO and Russia. And that would be the first hot war in the history of humanity between two significant nuclear powers. That would be something quite different from what we're seeing now. What we can expect to see is a huge amount of support. We know that we've already sent anti-tank missiles. We know that we've sent further weapons. Number 10 was reluctant to say what that further weaponry was that was announced yesterday that was being sent. But ultimately, when we look at the sanctions that were announced on Tuesday, and the scrutiny they came under yesterday on Wednesday, it was this iterative international approach that all of the House seemed to agree on. We had the chance to question a Labour Party spokesman on whether or not, because of course Keir Starmer in Prime Minister's questions was calling for further and faster sanctions at the start. They weren't, however, opposing the iterative process, the idea that you'd hold some things back were an event like the event that happened this morning to take place. So ultimately the West is still moving as one on this. The question is who will be first out of the blocks and what more will the UK do? Obviously, we have been holding stuff in reserve to deploy in the case of an event like this. And what more will Europe do as well? A big question mark over how much more can go ahead. Of course, there were big headlines made by the pausing of Nord Stream 2, the delaying of certification of that. Will they now cancel it in entirety? Will they deconstruct the pipeline that has already been constructed? And of course, Nord Stream 2 is not sending gas to Europe currently. That's just about more gas. What about Nord Stream 1 that currently funnels gas from Russia to Germany? Will there be moves on that? Big questions for Europe, for Britain and for America.
And in terms of our response, and let's hope we don't end up going sort of full-on military with this, but it's interesting. Whereas a lot of you getting in touch say, I mean, Gary says President Putin has shown his true colours. John says all my thoughts with the Ukrainian people. Jim says we need to back off from this completely. He can reach us with his bombers and submarines. He also has nuclear weapons, which have been recently tested. Let the EU and the USA deal with it. Alan says Boris must pull all British army and equipment back to the UK and lift all sanctions, for we, the British people, do not give our consent to join another war. I mean, there really isn't a great deal of appetite, is there, for us getting further involved in something when it comes to a military campaign?
The question is Britain a player on the world stage or not? We could retreat and become Switzerland if we really wanted to, but Britain is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We're one of the largest military spenders in the world, with a supplier of NATO's only aircraft carrier dedicated to this cause. We are a significant global player, the 5th largest economy in the world, one of the highest spends on military in the world, the 2nd highest proportional spend on military within NATO. We are a member of these alliances, and I think that to some extent it would be surprising if we were to retreat from those alliances and holding up the international order that has served so many so well since the end of the Second World War.
Well, Tom, I know you're going to keep a close eye on what's happening this morning for us from a political perspective and bringing us the latest lines from that Cobra meeting, which I can report has got underway in the last few moments. Thank you for now.
Let's talk to our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan. Morning to you, Liam. Look, just in the last few moments, we've had some comments from Ursula von der Leyen, who says, one of the EU presidents saying, we're going to target strategic sectors of the Russian economy. We will freeze Russian assets in the EU and stop the access of Russian banks to the European financial markets. I mean, clearly, there is a determination to really make Russia feel the squeeze here.
There is, Stephen. Good morning to you and to Isabel. Look, this conflict seems like a long way away, and we're sitting here talking about geopolitics and international alliances and so on. But for people here in the UK, this is going to impact the cost of living quite seriously. And any response by the Western world in terms of sanctions is going to have to consider the impact on voters here in the West in terms of their living standards. Russia is an energy superpower. It exports 40% of Europe's gas. We're seeing, in response to this serious military escalation overnight, we're seeing gas prices go up on wholesale markets. We're seeing oil prices go firmly above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. I'm sitting here on my phone looking at various obscure apps about food prices, the price of sunflower oil, the price of corn and wheat. Russia's the world's biggest wheat exporter. Ukraine and Russia between them control 80% of the world's supply of sunflower oil. These are very, very important basic commodities. which feed into the shopping baskets of people all over the Western world. We've had a cost of living crisis brewing for some time here in the UK. And as Vladimir Putin knows, he can make that cost of living crisis here in the West much, much worse if he wants to. So while this seems like a distant war, it doesn't seem to many people watching GB News anything to do with Britain. This is going to affect all of us if this escalation continues.
Liam, there's a huge amount, isn't there, of Russian money here, particularly in London, described by some as London grad. We've been issuing these so-called golden visas for some time to wealthy Russians. Will we be negatively impacted, in terms of our affluence if we do go after Russian money? I mean, there are concerns that these sanctions will affect us.
Well, there will be some ritzy wealth managers in the City of London, financial planners, lawyers and so on, who may have their lucrative businesses hit a bit. But look, the real issue for us is if we really turn the screw on sanctions, and as you say, Cobra's meeting now, the real issue is access to those Russian commodities if they retaliate, given their sanctions on us. There's almost no way that the Western world is going to cut Russia out of SWIFT. SWIFT is more than a messaging system. SWIFT is the way that banking transactions are settled across international borders. It's a system dominated by the US, and they can turn off that tap. On the other hand, we've got to realize that there are very, very serious Western business interests in Russia. BP, for instance, our thoroughbred oil company, owns a fifth of Russia's largest oil company. Boeing, the US aerospace giant, has massive ties to Russia. Russia controls world supplies of obscure sounding metals like palladium, titanium, of bauxite, which goes into aluminium. If the Russians want to make life difficult for us, then they really can. Russia and Ukraine control the world supply of something called neon gas, which is vital to make semiconductors that go into almost everything that's now manufactured these days. So this isn't a one-way street by any means. Yes, of course, in light of events overnight, there's shock, horror, disgust across much of the Western world, and politicians want to be seen to be doing something. But if they do serious sanctions that go beyond targeting a few oligarchs that frankly no one has ever heard of, then that will have real implications, not just for living standards here in the Western world, but for business, for jobs in the Western world. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. It is very deeply connected to the Western world. Our businesses and our business interests and our living standards are very much intertwined. That's what makes this situation so different from conflicts and standoffs during the Cold War.
OK, Liam, we'll leave it there for now. We'll catch up with you later. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, stay with us here on Breakfast. We'll continue to discuss and analyse this fast-moving story. After the break, we'll be joined by David Wooding and Dawn Neeson. They'll be going through the papers and giving their views on the story. See you in a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back with the time at 7:42. It's time to take a look at your, what day is it today? Thursday morning newspapers. We're joined in the studio by the former editor of the Daily Star, Dawn Neeson, and the political editor for The Sun on Sunday, David Wooding. And look, quite frankly, Dawn, a lot of the papers going to print last night before the significant developments. It was shortly before 3 a.m. this morning, UK time, when Russia launched this full-scale invasion into the Ukraine. That being said, still plenty to go through in the papers. Telegraph talking about the shelling in Ukraine.
Yeah, this is, it's quite, I quite like the personal effect here, because I can understand a little bit if I'm reading what it's actually like on the ground from people that are living there and experiencing it, rather than the military history, which is quite a lot to get your head around. But this is a very good report. It's on the front page of the Telegraph, and it's dispatched from the front line. And, you know, they've got ordinary people. It's a farming community, Isabel. And it's like they're being shelled constantly. And it's like, you know, a lot of them are veterans that live there as well, but they've become farmers. So it's like turn the clock back for them. And the horrors they're describing, in particular, the use of these things called Grad rockets, which have been used in the previous incursion, as we call it, in 2014, 2015, and they're incredibly inaccurate. So these people are in their farming communities, and these rockets are raining down, completely missing whatever they're aimed at, and just hitting anything and everything. And that there is no safety. There are no shelters there. These people feel like they're completely left at the mercy of the invading army at the moment.
And the result of that, of course, is lots of people will be fleeing. Some reports this morning about up to 5 million refugees, and that'll be a huge crisis.
Yeah, 5 million refugees, absolutely. It is, and you do wonder how it's, you know, and the thing is, I can't get my head around this. It's like it's just over a 3-hour flight away from here. We're not talking the other side of the world. No. We are talking 3 hours away. Beautiful country, really amazing people, and what they're going through now, your heart aches for them all.
David, interesting tweet from Russell Jones this morning. Morning to you, Russell. And he saw something, because when we were talking to Liam Halligan, it was about, you know, when it's very unlikely that they're going to stop SWIFT, because that would cut off Russia financially very severely, but will have huge effects for the rest of the world as well. And all, there's a lot of leverage on Russia's side and what they've got in terms of natural resources and everything else. Russell says we need a seismic shift away from China and their manufactured goods and Russian energy supplies. Are world leaders prepared to make the change, or within 20 years China would rule the world? Well, it's not a bad point, is it?
No, it's not. And some MPs have been making this point for some months. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of senior MPs who've said we need to break that reliance on China and Russia. I mean, the gas is the one big thing that the Europeans, where he has them in a hold, massively. And Huawei, the row over their influence in British society is of concern. But in the Daily Mail this morning, there's a big headline across 2 pages here where it says PM will cripple Russia. Now, I mean, action could have been taken in the past to do something here, but what's going to happen now is going to be a virtual summit of Boris Johnson, the US President Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron of France, and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to try and come up with some sanctions. I mean, they're talking about a long list that will inflict maximum pain, but will it really? They name people here who will be affected: Roman Abramovich of Chelsea, and Oleg Deripaska, and other senior Russian oligarchs. But there's about 500 people who will be targeted eventually, I guess.
It's interesting, we were talking to the Ukrainian MP earlier on, he said, how much does the West want blood money and blood gas?
Yes.
Which, I mean, it sounds right, but I mean, it's a fair point, isn't it? But we can't just stop it.
No.
Altogether,
because,
or not immediately.
Well, gas is the one, keep mentioning gas, that is the one issue that Europe have, and that might make them more hesitant about taking action which will cut off their own gas supply. It's something he could just switch off like that at the flick of a switch.
Yeah.
We're just looking at the latest lines coming through. This morning, the junior foreign minister, James Cleverly, has said that there will be large and severe sanctions, a package never seen before, against Russia. But the threats coming back from Russia, not just talking about sanctions, but about military response. I mean, President Putin saying any other countries who interfere will face consequences they've never seen before. Dawn.
And this is chilling, and the rhetoric. Look, with Putin, we know that he is the testosterone fueled. We've all seen those pictures, frankly, quite scary pictures of him bare-chested on horseback and
rolling
really
with his large dogs.
Yes, yeah, the alpha male thing going on. So he talks a very strong, fierce talk, and you hope that this is just the rhetoric he is using. But, you know, all this talk of sanctions now, I mean, nobody wants war. You know, absolutely, we said that in part one of our pay-per-view. Nobody wants bloodshed. Nobody wants, you know, boots on the ground of our lads and lasses who are serving in the forces. But all this talk of sanctions now, it's like, oh, well, we will do more sanctions soon. And it's like, it feels like if I was living in the Ukraine now, I'd be thinking that we need to do something now. And, you know, the talk of the reliance, especially the EU, of gas from Russia. And we know Germany has shut the Nord Stream 2 supply off now. But the reliance on it and our constant drive to the independence that I've got, you know, the net zero by 2035. And it's like, hold on a minute. Something's got to give now.
Well, yes, but in some respects, if net zero, if you build into that, I wanted to say reusable energy, but renewable energy, well, actually, this pushes the argument for that, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but we can't do it quick enough. And at the moment, we are sort of like, they're saying, oh, we're sort of like, that is so important. It's like, it's not actually. We need to stop relying now so much on Russia and China for our energy supply.
Just to say, in the last few minutes, the chair of Germany's Foreign Affairs Committee said new gas contracts with Russia are inconceivable.
Absolutely, of course they are. But do we might be OK because we only rely on them by 4%, but the EU... You know,
it's 40% in Germany.
Well, yes, and I suppose, you know, it might not affect us directly, but if Germany then has to find alternative sources of gas, it pushes up competition and our prices also go through the roof.
And everything.
And that is the concern, isn't it? I mean, we've just gone through a pandemic, David. Yeah. We've just already talked about the cost of living crisis that's on the horizon, irrespective of this new crisis. This will only deepen the problems, not only for the world, but particularly here on our home turf.
Yeah. If supplies are interrupted, then supply and demand costs go up, and that's going to happen not only with fuel, but with other essentials which will be interrupted by this. I mean, the consequences around the world are quite severe on this for the economies and supplies and the cost of living. We're going to have to dig deep, you know. It's going to... Prices are going to rocket.
Well, that's interesting when you, as you say that, David, because a lot of the problem with that is that a lot of people are already digging as deep as they can.
Yes.
So how do they dig any deeper?
Yeah.
How do they dig any deeper?
And it's all well and good saying the government have to help them. They're already struggling to find the cash, having spent £40 billion on the pandemic to try and alleviate the existing cost of living crisis. And now that's going to go even worse, then goodness knows what they can do to help.
And David and Dawn, I just want to ask you from the perspective of having two very experienced newspaper editors, hacks, if you will, in a very important and
You
valued free
can call
press.
us old, that's fine. We'll take it.
That's not what I mean. Well, look, take my point, which is that we have a free press in this country, which of course is an absolute column of any democracy. We are seeing already a war of words breaking out between the West and Russia and China, quite frankly. Yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine doing this address saying, look, people in Russia will probably not even hear what I'm saying because they're only hearing the propaganda that's being broadcast by Russian state media. And just in the last few moments, the Russian authorities denying a lot of the facts that we're hearing. They say that a downed Russian aircraft is not true. How important will the truth be? Will Western journalists and our reporting, fact-finding, be in the resolution to all of this?
This is a crucial point. I mean, the media is so splintered and fractured now with the internet and people getting their news from so many different sources. I mean, newspapers and TV stations like mine and yours are just part of the picture now. People are getting stuff from Twitter. There's fake news galore everywhere, and it's going to be very difficult to try and. I think people need to look at the real focus on the genuine, trustworthy news sources. The problem is there's so many others out there who are.
And Putin...
Well, you've got to. Look, sorry to burst in, David and Dawn. Thank you for that. We'll speak to you later on. Just because we want to bring in Sir Tony Brenton, who's former British ambassador to Russia, who can join us just for a couple of minutes this morning. So, Tony, good to see you. What's your reaction?
Well, surprise, firstly. This is the biggest gamble that Putin has taken probably in his career as president. But then unsurprised, actually. I mean, what Putin has been engaged in the negotiations over the last month or so has been trying to impress the West with the seriousness of his concerns about Ukraine. The West has acknowledged that to a limited extent, but really assumed that he's bluffing, that the troops are out there, he's not going to use them. And unfortunately, he wasn't bluffing. He's taken action. And a question, which is how far is he now planning to go? And it's not entirely clear from what he's said so far what he is intending. He's talked about a mission to protect the Donbass, whose administrations he has recognised. And that seems to be where the military action at the moment is concentrating. But he has also talked about the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, which means a much wider operation. Now, if he's focusing on the Donbass, they can almost certainly do whatever it is they intend to do quite quickly and successfully. The war will then be over. There'll be lots and lots of sanctions, lots and lots of condemnation, but sooner or later, I'm afraid the world will move on. If it's an operation to take out the whole of Ukraine, which actually Putin has explicitly denied. He says he doesn't plan to occupy Ukraine. But if it is that sort of operation, first, it's a much bigger gamble. Secondly, there's no guarantee of success. It would be a major, major military operation. And therefore, where we are afterwards depends immensely on how successful the military operation proves to be.
Say real question marks about what it is his intentions are, occupation or regime change or whatever it may be. Look, we spoke to a member of the Ukrainian parliament this morning who said that he wanted to see the West impose a no-fly zone over the country, much like was imposed over Syria. Do you think that is a realistic possibility? And what more can the West do? Is it just limited to sanctions? Because it seems, at least so far, they've been ineffective.
To impose a no-fly zone, you need to announce means of enforcing it. So are you going to shoot down Russian military planes? If so, this then becomes, in prospect, a war between Russia and the West. I think the likelihood of the West getting involved at the military level at all is very low. Indeed, Biden has explicitly said
that. Which, in some respects, you've got to have a sigh of relief over, haven't you? Because I mean, that could escalate into something absolutely horrific. But in the meantime,
no, we need to be. Sorry, can I just say this? We need to be very careful here. Our politicians have engaged in massive rhetoric about how appalling Russia is and how they can't breach the international order and all of that, which is fine as a way of talking in peacetime. We need to be very careful about what we say now. There's going to be lots of condemnation and all that. That we don't edge ourselves into actual involvement in the conflict, which I find it very difficult to believe the British people will want, certainly the American people don't want, and which would be very dangerous indeed.
Interesting that you say that as a diplomat. Of course, you know, words are absolutely your way of working, and I take your point that it's incredibly important. But equally, this morning we've heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that they don't recognise what Russia has done as constituted an invasion. Lots of people will be concerned that if we don't speak the correct rhetoric or respond correctly to this, then perhaps we might see similar scenes in Taiwan.
No, you're right. We need to be absolutely clear that what Russia has done is unacceptable. It's a breach of international law, all of that. The sanctions will come in. That won't actually change Russia's behavior, but it is, as you say, absolutely important to be very clear. But on the Chinese question, I was listening to Peter Ricketts a few minutes ago on the BBC, saying we need to mobilize the whole world against Russia. The Chinese are sitting very carefully on the fence. I think it is unlikely that we'll be able to mobilize them against Russia. And one, I think, almost inevitable consequence of what's going on now is that Russia and China are going to be pushed even more into each other's arms than has been the case so far.
What about the concern around on the NATO border? I mean, there's certainly calls from Poland and others to really have the NATO security there boosted. That's going to happen, isn't it?
Well, yes-ish. I don't believe... I mean, the Russians are actually gamblers, as we've just seen, but they're not stupid. They're not going to attack a NATO member state. NATO has about 10 times Russia's military expenditure. If Russia got into a conventional war with NATO, it would lose, and the danger of it coming close to losing is that you then start to think about going nuclear. Russia's not going to do that. It's right that we reinforce the self-confidence and the defensibility of member states of NATO, but I don't think they are genuinely in threat.
OK, so Tony Brenton, former British ambassador to Russia. Really good to get your thoughts this morning. Thanks very much for joining us. Do stay with us at home, whether you're listening on the radio or watching us on TV. We'll have all the very latest on this developing situation. As the Prime Minister says, Russia has now done an unprovoked attack into Ukraine. All the details in a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Explosions heard across Ukraine this morning as President Vladimir Putin has authorised a so-called special military operation in the country.
The sirens ring out over the capital Kiev as locals are warned of air raids.
Well, good morning. It is 8 o'clock on the 24th of February. You're watching and listening to Breakfast on GB News with Isabel and Stephen.
The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is currently holding a Cobra meeting to assess the threat. In a statement, he said Russia had launched an unprovoked attack on Ukraine.
The US President Joe Biden has tweeted that the prayers of the world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. We have all the very latest for you this morning.
Of course, what your thoughts as well, because this is going to impact us here in the UK, whether you're a military family or whether it's just a case of what impact it's going to have on the cost of living crisis. We are going to feel this. Send us your thoughts, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or send us a tweet at gbnews. So, that invasion has begun in the early hours of this morning, 3 a.m. UK time. Vladimir Putin sent his troops into Ukraine in a three-pronged attack. I mean, still mainly in the eastern region, but it is escalating further. Certainly airstrikes across some of the key military infrastructure across Ukraine. And now people are leaving key cities, and particularly Kiev. A lot of evacuations happening there. Is causing huge international concern, including here in the UK, where a Cobra meeting is underway. Another one. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, who's got the very latest for us. I mean, clearly we've got to have a robust response to this.
We certainly do. The Cobra meeting started around half an hour ago, and we're expecting it to go on for some time. The Prime Minister will be sitting with senior cabinet ministers, but also senior political aides in the bowels of Downing Street, talking through what the UK response should and could be. Ultimately, there are a number of things that the UK and indeed our Western partners have been preparing for in the further barrage of sanctions. Of course, on Tuesday, when our first barrage of sanctions were announced, this was very much in the context of being the first in an iterative process of steps, and many, many more steps were expected to be taken, perhaps not as soon as today, but it's now likely that this is an expedited process, a sped-up process. We're going to see some significant moves today.
I mean, we're hearing from James Cleverly. They're talking about sort of unprecedented sanctions. It's difficult to know quite what he means by that, though.
Well, that's the language that's being shared not just in London, but also in Brussels, hearing many voices from the European Union today saying that sanctions, the heaviest sanctions that have ever been applied by that bloc will be being applied. Ultimately, we're going to see a huge amount of coordination between Washington, Brussels and London on this. The West has been trying to move as one throughout this process, and whilst there was disagreement over the scale of incursion on Tuesday in those disputed regions, those parts of Ukraine that Russia now sees as independent, but the West still see as part of Ukraine, now it's very clear that what's being termed as a full-scale invasion has taken place. There is no ambiguity now.
And Tom, for anyone who's wondering, what relevance this has to us, because this is, a 3-hour flight away out on the eastern remit of the European borders. I suppose you could judge just by who attended the previous Cobra meeting. We don't have a readout of who's attending today's. The full extent of the threat to the UK. Last time it was the business secretary. We heard from the culture secretary afterwards. There's the role of sport in all of this, the impact on our energy, the concerns about our cyber security. This is widespread.
Absolutely. We had everyone from defence to the Treasury to international trade. Ultimately, the UK is a country that is so interconnected to the global economy. And we were hearing on this programme from Liam Halligan a little earlier how Russia and Ukraine between them comprise 80% of the world's market in things like sunflower oil. They're massive exporters of wheat. If we are going to have full-scale war in Ukraine, the prices of those basic commodities, and wheat means everything from bread to beer in this country, could be soaring up and up in terms of cost to consumers who are already experiencing a cost of living crisis. And that's before we even get to energy. Now, the business secretary will be making huge cases in terms of what the response is to this. Of course, the UK only imports around 3% of our gas from Russia, but Europe imports around 40% of its gas from Russia. And of course, if Europe starts importing from America rather than Russia, we mainly import from America, that's going to push those prices up for us as well. This is all so interconnected.
I suppose, sorry, to just pick up on that. I mean, there is no response from us that won't involve some level of self-harm because, you know, there is a lot of Russian money that boosts the economy here at home. The impact in terms of sending weaponry, perhaps to Ukraine, will see an increase in spend at a cost to the taxpayer. So I suppose we have to brace ourselves, don't we, as British people, to see us having to tighten our belts and feel the consequences of this.
Well, what senior ministers will be looking at today is a series of bad options. There are no good options in this situation. Allowing a hostile foreign pariah state to invade, to take over, to snatch an independent Western-facing country like Ukraine would be extraordinarily bad for the global economy. Full-scale war, protracted war, as would no doubt take place in that circumstance in Ukraine, would be incredibly bad for our import market as well. So too would sanctions. The question is, which is the least bad option here? What will hurt us the least? And potentially what will hurt us the least is a strong response to Russia. Yes, acknowledging that sanctions will increase the cost of living here, but potentially by less than full-scale war may.
But have a look at this, Tom. I mean, this is the situation in Kiev this morning. Oh, look, it's going to be no surprise, is it? But look at that. I mean, miles and miles of blocked-up traffic, people just trying to get out. And this is also going to be something which has to be factored in our response, doesn't it? Because there is going to be this huge influx of refugees. Now, whether there's, of course, there's arguments about whether who we take or not, as the case may be. But nevertheless, we're still likely to be required to send some sort of assistance, aren't we, financial or otherwise?
Ukraine is a country of 44 million people. It's one of the largest European countries by population. And we've seen how Russia and Belarus have been very happy to play games with human migration in the past, sending migrants to the borders of Poland in recent months. This could become a significant crisis for the whole of Europe. But also, if we're looking at what the scene in Kiev, where people have heard bombs, have heard explosions, likely to do with the military airfield that's just outside Kiev, but hearing those air raid sirens, it sounds like something out of the Second World War. It evokes all of those memories, but also looking at the scale of attack that has happened across Ukraine. And I know the BNO news agency has reported a map whereby even in the very west of Ukraine, just miles from Poland, an EU state, a NATO state, there has been Russian attack, just miles from that border. This is significant and this is affecting so much more. The knock-on effects will be huge.
Yeah, and that was confirmed to us as well on this programme by a Ukrainian parliamentarian that air bases on that western border with Poland had also been targeted. Look, as we're looking at those pictures, it's worth reminding people that the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, has imposed martial law on the country, which urges people actually to stay at home. But clearly people just do not feel safe, having woken up, as you say, to the highly evocative sounds of those air raids this morning. Civilians have been told that they have permission to bear arms now. We've seen those pictures, haven't we, in the newspapers, the broadsheets, the tabloids, right across the board for days of old and young wielding weapons. I just want to get your take on the international response to this. There's been, as you would expect from the West, widespread condemnation this morning. China standing out quite notably, the Chinese Foreign Affairs Department saying that they don't recognise Russia's actions in Ukraine as an invasion.
It's quite extraordinary, but this is almost par for the course. Over the past 8 years or so, we have seen an incredible move by both Russia and China to become much more economically intertwined than they ever were before. As the golden age, as it was so called, between London and Beijing relations faded around the middle of the last decade, it grew between Russia and China. These are two countries that have become much more economically interdependent. Russia relying heavily on a lot of technology, finance, trade in general from China. And this is one of the concerns about a Western sanctions package. Yes, we can cut Russia off from the Western financial system and all its might and all its technology, But ultimately, we have the growing power of China, which has a huge financial might. It's predicted to become the largest economy in the world within this decade, but also has huge technological prowess. Now, if we're seeing a new axis, what some might refer to as an axis of evil between those two burgeoning powers, we are entering into potentially the beginnings of a new Cold War.
But as you say, well, I mean, cold sounds better than hot at the moment, which is what we're looking at. I mean, it's a sort of better of two evils, isn't it? But we are in a situation, as you were saying before, there's no good option here. And if we try, someone messaged in before and said, well, we need to stop our reliance on China manufacturing and Russian energy. Well, the problem with that is it is going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot.
It certainly is, and particularly when we look at sort of the boon that's come to British consumers through cheap goods from China, everything from clothing to technology over the last 20 years, as China has opened up and become in its little way more capitalist on its coastal regions in particular. That has created huge wealth for China, but also huge wealth in terms of trade as it does for the West. The question is, how moral is it to continue on the path that we have been? Enormous questions for cabinet ministers around that Cobra meeting table this morning.
OK, Tom, thank you.
Well, joining us now is the former head of the British Army, Lord Richard Dannett. A very warm welcome back to the programme. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's being described by the German Foreign Minister as a day of infamy. Shortly before 3 a.m. this morning, all of the West's worst fears realised as that full-scale invasion got underway.
Well, I completely agree with that. It is the events, or the beginning of a series of events that we desperately hoped would not happen. And we must be in no doubt at all that Russia has now put herself into an extremely dangerous position. And even if Mr. Putin tries to call these focused and targeted operations, we must be in no doubt that this is a major invasion and we must treat it as such. And the reaction by the West must be as strong as it possibly can be in terms of economic sanctions, international isolation as far as Russia is concerned, and we must all expect to take some pain. Fuel prices will rise, cost of living will rise. We will all take some pain in this. It's a very dark day for Europe, and our leaders must be in no doubt that they've got to put maximum pressure on Mr. Putin.
It's a dark day for the armed forces as well, General, isn't it? I mean, in the sense that there is no indication at this time that we are going to engage with Russian forces. That would bring a whole new world of pain upon us all. But we're deployed to nearby states. We know a lot of people are on standby. A lot of troops were recalled yesterday. This is a concerning time for them and their families.
Yes, of course, you're absolutely right. But we must keep a very clear distinction between what is going on in Ukraine and what potentially could go on in the rest of Europe. The other nations of Europe, many of which we've talked about on this programme before, such as Estonia and Poland, that the UK has been supporting, are countries that we will continue to support because they are NATO members. And it may well be that the UK armed forces deploy in larger numbers to support our friends in those NATO countries in Eastern Europe. What's going on in Ukraine is different. As we've said many times, it's different because NATO is not, is that Ukraine is not a NATO member. This fight is Ukraine's fight, and Ukraine is going to have to fight Russia on her own, albeit we're giving her moral support, military weaponry support, but this fight is Ukraine's fight. That doesn't mean to say that we should in any sense lessen our opposition and vilification of Russia in the round. Russia has crossed the Rubicon in the major way that we hoped would not happen, but clearly has happened. And that's why the economic pressure, the international isolation pressure on Russia must be intense, immediate, huge and lasting. But I have to say, I do worry from some of the reports that I'm hearing from inside Ukraine. Even yesterday, we were hearing that Ukraine has not ordered full mobilization. Now, full mobilization means getting their units themselves ready for war. There's been a lot of talk about Ukrainians fighting and fighting hard, and that's good. But I'm worried if they've not fully mobilized their units, that this could be a lightning strike by Russia. It could well be successful. But the West must not in any way misunderstand that whether the Ukrainians fight hard or whether the Ukrainians don't fight hard, this is foul war in Europe in the 21st century, and it places Russia absolutely at the bottom of the league of any nation that any sensible nation wants to talk to. This is bad news for the world, and certainly bad news for Russia at the present moment today.
I'm interested to hear, I mean, you say this is a dark day for Europe, and yet you stress that this is a war for Ukraine. It's not for us at this stage. Does it matter to an extent what the motives are of President Putin? I mean, if this is about occupation or perhaps about regime change, does that change things, do you think?
No, I don't think so. This is what he would like us to understand, and he would like us to try and apply a nuanced response. But what we've been saying all along is that if Russia invades in any meaningful fashion, that will have been a crossing of the Rubicon, a crossing of the line, and Russia must expect the full force of sanctions, international isolation, and vilification from the West. There's no point us being gradual about this or nuanced about this. He has crossed the line and he's beyond the pale now. If we step back from that, then he will undoubtedly have won. He must not win, he must lose, and must be made to pay.
Is this an indication that we just haven't done enough over recent years? I mean, particularly with what we saw in Crimea in 2014. Are we sort of reaping the cost of a very lacklustre international response last time?
Well, you could argue that, and I think that's something that historians can argue in time to come. I think the important thing is to focus on the here and now, what is going on now, and being very clear that Russia has crossed a line. The West's response must be massive in political, economic, and diplomatic terms, and that this is something from which Russia will not recover easily, and has set her own development back considerably.
OK, Sir Richard Dannett, we must leave it there. Really good to get your thoughts this morning, calling it a dark day for Europe, but stressing that there is no point being gradual or nuanced in those sanctions.
Actually, look, General, I'm sorry to jump in just after wrapping you up, but can I just ask about, we've sent so many, we know particularly NLAWs and javelins and things over the anti-tank weapons. Hugely expensive, particularly the javelins. Look, we've got to see greater investment in our armed forces now, haven't we? The numbers are dwindling significantly in the UK. That's all got to be changed, hasn't it?
I mean, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you've asked the question. I think what we're seeing now is a return to land warfare in Europe. And you look at the United Kingdom's land warfare capability, it has been systematically dismantled since the Defence Review in 2010. We've got to have a rapid review of our capability, a decision to considerably increase our spending on land warfare capability and get on with it very quickly. The world has changed. We've got to change with it. And I'm afraid it's going to be a coster, and the Chancellor has got to be prepared to put his hand in not one pocket, but both pockets.
Yeah. Okay. General Lord Dannett, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, let's bring you up to date on some of the rest of the day's news this morning. And almost 2 years down the line, COVID laws in England come to an end from today. It means people who test positive with the virus will no longer legally be required to isolate. It follows Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Living with COVID strategy, which was announced on Monday, and also includes getting rid of free universal testing from April.
The UK has pledged £160 million to speed up the development of vaccines against deadly diseases. Research project CEPI is on a mission to slash the time it takes to make a vaccine to 100 days. That's a third of the time it took to develop the first COVID jab.
Credit card application fraud attempts surged at the fastest rate in 5 years in the last 3 months of 2021. Data from a credit reference agency shows that nearly 3/4 of detected cases involved fraudsters using the victim's current address to apply for credit.
Look, stay with us here on GB News. We'll bring you all the latest from Ukraine after we've had a look at the weather for you.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your forecast. It's a cold day on Thursday. We've got snow and lightning across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and for all of us, some strong winds. Now, we've got this cold front continuing to clear its way southeastwards across the UK, so much of the country is in this blue air, cold air with strong winds, as you can see from these tightly packed isobars. So we've got some early rain clearing southern and eastern parts of England. Behind it, the colder air is sinking in, and that's where we've got the showers feeding in through the afternoon. Widely, we'll see some quite frequent snow showers across Scotland and Northern Ireland, 10 to 20 centimetres possible over the hills, combined with frequent lightning, so we have that weather warning in place. With the strong winds, we'll see blizzards over the mountains, so some really poor visibility at times. Elsewhere, plenty of sunny spells, but rattling through will be those heavy showers, some hail, some sleet and rain all in the mix, and it's a cold day. Now, we'll continue to see those showers through the first part of Thursday evening, pushing their way across the country, but tending to ease through the small hours of Friday as we start to see a ridge of high pressure in. So with clearing skies and the winds easing down, I suspect some places will have a bit of a frost as we start Friday morning. Temperatures 2s and 3s in our towns and cities, lower in the countryside. But it does mean where we have the frost in the morning, there will be a lot of sunshine around. Still a few wintry showers, perhaps down the spine of the Pennines over towards eastern England, but they should clear away. And then for most of us, it's a fine and bright afternoon with spells of sunshine, although the cloud does increase across the northwest later on with some outbreaks of rain into western Scotland. Temperatures for many places around where they should be for this stage in February, coming in around 10 or so across the south. And we keep the fine weather through much of Friday, but in towards the weekend, cloud will thicken further north. There is the chance of some rain, but it stays largely dry and bright with temperatures near normal towards the south. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
It is 8:24. This is GB News. Let's get the latest on the developing situation in Ukraine. It's all about analysis at this stage because we're getting all these reports of what's going on, but it's then how do we interpret that? Let's talk to security expert Will Geddes, who's here. Will, sure, we're just talking to General Lord Dannatt. What did you make of his analysis?
Well, General Dannatt's analysis, I think, was pretty much on point in terms of what we can do and what we can't do, and it's really what we can't do. But I think, as we were discussing much earlier in the programme, it's about taking this from a micro position, which is obviously the Ukraine, to a more macro position. What is Putin's ultimate end goal? And it's not so much in just the actions that he's carrying out right now in Ukraine, but it's what threats he presents to other Balkan states and Baltic locations, all the way from Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, all the way up to the Scandinavian regions. And the feeling is, and certainly amongst many of the experts that I've been talking to, is that he is looking to re-establish the old USSR, the old Russian states, and try and bring them back into the mother country, so to speak.
But he couldn't do that without then engaging NATO, which seems at this stage unthinkable, doesn't it?
It does seem unthinkable, but again, if we look at the situation happening in Ukraine today, did we believe that this was potential? I mean, I think even analysts like myself thought this would be turning into a Cuban Missile Crisis. It was going to be very much to the 11th hour and then ultimately a de-escalation. But we've seen very direct action. Putin is arrogant enough to believe that he can get away with this because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And he sees weak leadership amongst the Western heads. We've had Macron communicating, we've had Boris Johnson communicating, we had the Munich Security Conference, none of which seems to have had any effect whatsoever. So General Lord Dannatt, his comments about us taking a very robust position, and I think we've got to see what Boris Johnson says, and then ultimately off the back of the Cobra meeting, but also what President Biden says, whether they are really going to come down hard on Putin, because if they don't, we're going to see this invidious mission creep by Putin into other countries.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Cobra meeting there. That is this emergency meeting that's being chaired by the Prime Minister, started about an hour ago. We're waiting to hear the latest on that. But interesting you say, a lot of us surprised by this incursion by the Russians, weren't really sure if it would actually happen. So Tony Brenton echoing that this morning to us on this programme. Of course, the former British ambassador to Russia saying he's quite surprised at the actions being taken. That being said, it was quite clear from what Lord Dannatt was saying is that we really cannot have a gradual response anymore in terms of sanctions. We need to go hard and we need to go fast.
Absolutely. We've really got to blanket and show Putin that we are robust. We are going to be opposed to this. That unless he withdraws, unless there are some democratically created environments, and yes, there are republics of Donetsk, and of Luhansk and Donetsk, there are situations where, yes, there are democracies there or independent democracies that need to be established for Ukraine to be able to survive. Having said that, if we don't react effectively and resiliently and robustly, then Putin's not going to see us as any kind of opposition, or NATO necessarily for that matter.
But it's interesting then, because obviously what the strategists need to do is at least attempt to get into Putin's mindset, which is very difficult, because it was Sir Tony who's been telling us over the past couple of weeks, and a man, he knows Putin, he's met him many times, and says, he's not stupid, he's got a lot of bravado, but he's not a stupid man, and this action is going to cost dear. Well, as Tony said, he got that one wrong. So what is Putin prepared to take in terms of punishment?
Well, I think, bearing in mind his strength and partnership with President Xi in China, he's in a situation where he doesn't feel necessarily reliant on the Western economies. There is sovereign funds that they do need to raise on international markets. I think removing Russia from SWIFT will have a very financially dramatic impact, obviously, on Russia.
But it seems unlikely that's going to happen.
But it does seem unlikely that's going to happen. So, I, to be honest, wouldn't want to be sitting in Boris Johnson's seat right now, because he's going to make some very hard decisions at that Cobra meeting and as a result of that Cobra meeting. So only time will tell. But if it is soft-soaped, if it is only a soft solution and it is only gradual, and as Lord Dannatt said, it has to be swift, it has to be hard, and it has to be fast.
Well, there's so many layers to this. I mean, obviously the focus this morning, given that invasion around 3 o'clock this morning UK time, we've been focusing a lot on the military threat. There's, of course, also the war of words, the propaganda that's been going on. We saw the action being taken against Russia today, and other state broadcasters of Ofcom launching an investigation into them, and we're hearing a lot of the propaganda coming out of Russia. But there's also the cyber war, isn't there, that already underway. We're hearing from Ukraine today. And I'm just looking at some tweets on Twitter, warnings that the Twitter trolls, the Russian Twitter bots are out in force this morning. Easy to spot, often fewer than 100 followers, lots of random numbers and letters in their Twitter handles. Some are sometimes more sophisticated, and the advice is just to block them, because they're putting out tweets like this as an example of one. You may be advocating declaring war on Russia, but are you willing to fight on the front line? It's starting, isn't it?
Yes, we're going to see this across social media. And any of the viewers have to watch very carefully for this kind of rhetoric, this kind of propaganda, which is going to be pushed around. You know, wars these days are fought on so many different platforms. And one of the advantages that Putin has is he's been carrying out a lot of very surreptitious actions, whether it be with the submarine activity, whether it be air incursion activity into British airspace, into other European airspace. You know, they've been preparing for this for quite some time. But it's been done by stealth. It's been done very, very carefully. So he's now only showing his hand in terms of how robust he wants to be. So much as you were saying, Steve, about your colleague saying that he didn't anticipate Putin, a lot of people didn't anticipate Putin being quite as blatant as he has turned out to be, particularly in Ukraine.
I mean, it's interesting, as Isabel said, with these sort of Twitter bots and that sort of propaganda campaign, which can have a significant effect. But in terms of cyber warfare, if they're going to start attacking power stations or you know, issues like that, now that is something which the whole world is going to have to be very aware of. I mean, GCHQ presumably are monitoring that very closely.
Oh, very closely. And they will be briefing, no doubt, the Prime Minister at the Cobra meeting as to a spike and increase. If we're seeing this already in social media, inevitably, the one thing that Russia has is not only state-sponsored hackers and cyber terrorists, so to speak, but there are loads of third parties that are sympathetic to the Russian state. So you have a lot of very, very sophisticated capability out there by persons and parties to a degree unknown that will be launching various attacks, some of which, much like the separatists, will be a plausible deniability for the state to say we weren't necessarily behind that.
Can I just ask you, because we've talked about this collaboration between Russia and China, this sort of linking up of how they're operating at the moment, and China, we know when it comes to cyber warfare, has got virtual towns of people all lined up in server rooms doing what they can. That collaboration there, I mean, we're not saying that it's happening at the moment, but that also holds a huge concern, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, China, a lot of their cyber warfare capability is generally directed more at their own people and particularly within their own region. But I think what we need to be watching for is the increase of activity, particularly against Taiwan. I think there's going to be a very similar kind of playbook that the Chinese are going to implement against Taiwan. In the same way as they did with Hong Kong. It was almost before we could realise it, Hong Kong was pretty much taken. And I think we're going to see the same thing in Taiwan. But bear in mind, in Taiwan, there's obviously a huge US military presence as well. So there are various different ways the bear is going to be prodded.
And finally, we'll get us, you know, speaking of playbooks, as the elephant in the room, as Stephen described it earlier, the parallels that are being drawn, do you think rightly, between President Putin and Hitler?
Again, we discussed this a little earlier. It's too early to necessarily say, but I think we can draw some similar trajectories of what we've seen historically.
I suppose in terms of an attack, an invasion in an unprovoked manner is what is so evocative of the Second World War.
Indeed, and we're seeing that today in Ukraine.
Okay.
We'll get us, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. We'll catch up with you later. Look, we're going to take a short break, but we're going to be back with more analysis and see what the papers make of all of this. Talking to Dawn Neeson and David Wooding.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
So, of course, that Cobra meeting is underway this morning. It started an hour ago. It's currently 8:36, by the way, if you're listening on the radio. So they've had an hour or so. You'd imagine some sort of conclusions are going to be happening before too long. Get some news. This is the situation in Kiev this morning. As you can see, all that traffic queuing to get out, understandably so. The amount of concern there, the sirens, air raid sirens were going off this morning. So people are just wanting to get out, trying to find some safety. It's a hugely concerning situation. The paper's running, well, a little bit behind everyone else this morning, understandably so, but they've still got some pretty good analysis. Let's go through them with the former editor of the Daily Star, Dawn Neeson, and political editor for The Sun on Sunday, David Wooding. Look, David, in all of this, it is going to be fascinating to see what comes out of this Cobra meeting with all the intelligence that the Prime Minister is going to be presented with at the moment. And, of course, looking at the downsides of whatever action, sanction, economic action he's going to want to take, there is going to be a downside for the British public. There's just no getting away from it.
Well, yes, Russia has threatened to react militarily if anybody takes him on that way, and similarly he will respond with tit-for-tat measures on anything we do. So, of course, there's the gas supplies into Europe will be one problem that will send gas prices rocketing even more than they are already. And of course, the big way we can get him is by stopping the movement of Russian money, particularly through the SWIFT fast payment scheme. But of course, there's a price to pay for that here, because it will affect us too.
Dawn, you've been looking a lot this morning about the human cost,
Yes,
the human
very
impact. I know
much
that
so.
on a personal note, you've got a friend in Kiev
Yes.
that you've been in contact with today, and we're just
Yes.
looking at these pictures, everybody trying to flee the country despite being told by the President to stay indoors.
Well, it's interesting, Isabel, how quickly things have escalated since the couple of hours that you've been on air this morning. And my friend this morning, she's a hairdresser out there, and she was literally getting up and going to work. And then the sirens went off, so she thought, right, OK, let's not go home. And now she was saying traffic was normal, people were going about their everyday lives, and now you're seeing scenes of people quite clearly just trying to get out of the city. The problem is, where are they going to go? I mean, it's like, you know, this is going to, if it really does kick off in style, this is going to displace 5 million people. And it's just frightening as to how they are going to cope. We are going to cope with this. And the other thing with this situation is an awful lot of misinformation coming out, certainly from Russia. And there's one story I noticed, it was in the Sun today already, and people are believing this as well. It's about a Russia's Security Council allegedly met on Monday just before 5 p.m. Moscow time. But in the clip that Putin put out, you can quite clearly see the wristwatch participant was showing a completely different time. Yeah. So there's already so much misinformation coming out. And the thing is well, people are listening to it, people are believing it. Even over here, like who's firing what, where, when. And it's a mess that is really difficult to get to the bottom of. But, you know, if you were there now, what would you be doing? I mean, I think I probably would be doing the same thing.
I'll tell you what, something interesting has just dropped on the wires, David. And we were talking to Will Geddes about the wider implications along Russia's border. But Finnish President Niinisto has responded to calls at Finland. I hadn't realised Finland wasn't in NATO, actually. But it says calls for Finland to immediately apply for NATO membership are understandable, but not from the real world. Well, look, fair point. They know it better than we do. But actually, these countries... I mean, obviously, the Russian situation with Finland is long and difficult. It just raised very real concerns for any country bordering on Russia. I mean, particularly those who don't have that NATO protection.
Yeah, so we've sent all these reinforcements into the Eastern Front there, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, which are in NATO. Poland's in NATO. Of course, as you rightly say, Finland is not. And Finland, a vastly European country, member of the EU, one of our own, and it's right bordering Russia, and has been under the jackboot of the old Soviet regime in the past. Yeah. So there's a lot of bitter feeling there.
There's a lot of questions to be asked, I suppose, about the West's response to, first of all, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but also capitalising on so-called dirty Russian money and lots of allegations back and forth between Labour and the Conservatives. Yesterday, Labour MPs were accused of backing Russia over NATO, and the Tories were accused of having £2 million of Russian money. There is undeniably a link, it's very much involved in the British economy now, isn't it, Russian money?
Very much so, and this is why you do, I mean, the cynic in you starts to wonder why we haven't taken tougher sanctions immediately to try and quell this situation. I mean, because there was so much more we could have done, and I personally feel the sanctions that we've taken, sort of like, 3 very rich Russians and 5 small banks just don't appear to be enough. And I thought if you really wanted to, yes, it would affect us, it would affect us all, but to tackle the SWIFT situation, to stop the money transfer, to stop the money being sloshed around, and we haven't even cancelled yet. I mean, we will, I'm sure, the Champions League final, which is due to be played in St Petersburg on the 28th of May. I mean, hello, why? We need to be doing more. But I do find it slightly strange that 11 Labour MPs have backed demands from Stop the War Coalition for the government to change its policy and start working for peace, not confrontation. We're not the ones doing the confrontating at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness to the government, the British government, the Western and the European governments on the Champions League final, it's down to UEFA to do that. But they should be piling pressure on UEFA to do something.
Well, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Look, David, can we look at the Mail? Because this is interesting. It all boils down to politics at home to an extent. But they're talking about Labour hypocrisy in all of this, now we are in this time of crisis.
Yeah, invariably the politicians get political about it. I mean, we had the Labour Party attacking the Tories over their £2 million worth of donations. It's not as if it's influenced any reaction that this government's had. The Tories are now pointing out that there were 11 Labour MPs, but 14 Labour bigwigs in general, including some peers, who have backed a Stop the War Coalition motion attacking NATO. Now, I find this bizarre. I mean, and then David Lammy, who's in the shadow cabinet, has even earned money from RT, the Russian television, which has been spouting propaganda. Strange enough, I was walking down Whitehall, as I do most days, and there was a demo outside number 10 of Ukrainians a few days ago, and they had their Ukraine flags around, so I stopped to have a chat to them and whatever. And it crossed my mind, where are the Stop the War Coalition now? They take to the streets often when there's a war in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's always when we're getting involved. The Russians are getting involved. We haven't made much of a big problem.
I just want to bring a breaking news line in. I don't know if perhaps those at UEFA were listening to our show. This came through at 8:41. The time is 8:43, so the timing is quite interesting. They said contingency plans are being drawn up by UEFA over where to host this season's Champions League final. That's according to the PA News Agency. But that is interesting because that is, as you say, due to happen in May. The Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries saying she would like to see that happen, and it looks like UEFA are listening to those concerns.
So we're sitting in the agenda. I think they were listening to us, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. The news lines that have just been breaking and are actually worth reporting. Ukraine International Airlines, which links Gatwick Airport with Kiev, have suspended all flights, as have Ryanair, for at least the next fortnight. Look, there were calls this morning from...
And Wizz Air, actually.
And Wizz Air, worth saying. So, look, things are developing at pace this morning.
Yeah, I mean, look, we are in this awful situation, David, and there is going to be... I mean, we've touched on it already, but there's going to be a lot of people at home who are watching this saying, yeah, this is awful, but, how is this going to affect me when they're already... The number of calls we get, people saying, yeah, I can't afford to pay the electricity bill. What am I going to do when the prices go up again? What am I going to do when national insurance goes up? We just haven't got any money left at all. if things go up further, and we're talking about petrol, we're talking about energy prices, we're talking about food in the supermarkets, we're talking about inflation hitting 8% by April, there's going to be a hell of a lot of people in this country who are absolutely up against the wall.
There's going to be a tide of human misery, Steve, and it'll be at all levels. I mean, from the people living in Ukraine, who will be suffering the worst. Let's not forget the Russians, whose innocent sons, daughters have been sent out to fight in that country and will come back in body bags. And then you'll have the people who are struggling with their bills, right down to people in this country and other countries across Europe who are in abject poverty, who will be really, really feeling it. So the shockwaves of this will go right round the world.
But we can't do the keep calm and carry on thing.
No.
Can we? We've got to. There's got to be some. The money is tight for government as much as anybody else, but we've got to do something, haven't we, Dawn?
We have. I mean, nobody wants to see military action and bloodshed. But I mean, hopefully stronger sanctions will do it, and Putin will see sense. But there was an interesting poll this morning as well about which countries would be willing to see military action. And interestingly, the two most keen on it were the USA and Denmark, and the two least keen were Germany and Italy, with the UK falling somewhere in between the two. So, I mean, it's there isn't an appetite for this, and we all hope that sanctions will work, because no one wants, their sons and their daughters coming home in body bags.
But there doesn't seem to be any outcome which won't involve prices rocketing, because if there is a full-blown war and it spreads, then that's going to impact prices in the same way that sanctions will.
Yeah.
So we just...
So we're looking at least worst option.
Yes. Absolutely.
Basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's hugely depressing.
It's great, isn't it? It is depressing.
But, Stephen, there is good news, because we have been here before.
Oh, go on.
We have, absolutely. Russian leader Tsar Nicholas I, the first Crimean crisis, he was beaten, defeated, and Russia ended up in a very, very sorry state at the time. So there is precedent for coming out of this on top.
We'll leave it on that note, shall we? Political editor of The Sun on Sunday, David Wooding. Oh, in fact, we've been told our next guest isn't ready, so maybe we'll do one more article. Now, you were referring, of course, to Ben Wallace's comparisons between Putin yesterday and Tsar Nicholas I.
Yeah.
He came out and said that Putin's gone full Tonto. A lot of people yesterday think he maybe gone too far with that, but given the developments overnight, perhaps he knew something we didn't, David.
Yes, this piece that he's written in The Sun is fascinating. It does liken him to Tsar Nicholas I, 170 years ago, who too thought that force and military might were his path to greatness. He too thought his armies were invincible, and he ended up with, let's tone down the language a little bit, he ended up with his backsides handed back to him on a plate.
Very nicely
done. And then there's a wonderful picture of Tsar Nicholas on horseback, and that one of Vladimir Putin bareback riding a horse.
At least Tsar Nicholas had clothes on.
I know, it's enough to put people off their Kellogg's.
But isn't it interesting that Ben Wallace said, didn't he? He was talking sort of off the record to troops, wasn't he? Saying, well, we kicked his backside then, we can do it again. Well, we're in a nuclear age now. We're in a nuclear age, and there's someone with his finger on the button over in Moscow who has gone full Tonto.
Yes.
This is a whole different ballgame.
But do we really think he would be willing to do that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? Because we're thinking he wasn't willing to go into Ukraine.
Well,
just a few days ago.
I mean, you think that the end game plan for him might be to rebuild the Soviet Union and take back all the countries that are now independent were part of the Soviet Union. And that does include, obviously, countries like Estonia, which are very worried, we know already, who are part of NATO. And, NATO has 3.3 million military personnel. The Russians have 1 million. If we are talking it coming to that, then...
No, but Steve, you actually hit the nail on the head, and you cannot underestimate the severity of the situation we're in here. This is the most dangerous crisis the world has faced since the end of the Second World War. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, at least he turned back before they got the missiles onto Cuba. Now they've actually gone ahead and invaded. So it has escalated.
Yeah, and David Wooding, just to reiterate what you're saying there, we just heard in the last few seconds, the German foreign minister said that he woke up to a different world this morning. He says this is a day of infamy. We heard Lord Richard Dannett this morning saying this was a dark day for Europe. So lots of people indeed sharing that view this morning. I suppose the issue, and I ask you this as newspaper hacks, very experienced newspaper editors yourselves, is the different fronts that this war will be fought on. We're not just talking about the military, we're also talking about cyber attacks, we're also talking about propaganda.
Yes.
And that's already hitting home. I mean, Nadine Dorries, in an interview this morning, is already saying that she thinks that Russia Today, the state broadcaster, which we get in this country, is already spreading very, very harmful disinformation. We receive that in this country, and the plug should be pulled on that. But then again, you know, we don't know the strength of feeling of the ordinary Russians who are obviously facing their sons and daughters being sent to war. And they do get the BBC World Service, as we were talking earlier on. So
we pull the plug on RT, then they can pull the plug on the BBC. So we need to get our information out into Russia as much. And I think it's got pretty small viewing figures, RT, in this country. Leave it to Ofcom, I say.
Yeah. It's interesting. Hearing from the German Foreign Minister, Baerbock, talking about launching the full sanctions packet. Now, we do know that all of this is being coordinated. I mean, there's no getting, whatever the Prime Minister comes out with here, it's all being coordinated across Europe and with the United States. So the full packet, I mean, you wonder quite what that will mean. Quite what that, especially with... And Germany's a very interesting position to look at because of their heavy reliance on Russian gas.
When we talk about sanctions to people out there who just have ordinary lives, it's often just can't be grasped.
Forgive me for jumping in. We've been waiting to talk to Pat McFadden, and he's just got on the line. Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Morning to you. Look, what should we do? What needs to be done now?
Russia needs to be cut off from the world economically for this completely unjustified and unprovoked attack, which has resurrected the old imperialist idea of spheres of influence, where Russia will deny the freedom of its neighbours to choose their own path. That's what needs to happen. And this is a big test for the democratic world, because President Putin has decided that he can absorb whatever pain he thinks will be inflicted. He may be making a judgment that the West is weak. We have to come together as a democratic world now, and short of military measures, because nobody wants a shooting war, to inflict the maximum economic sanctions and isolation that we can.
The problem in all of this, I mean, you've set it out perfectly, is that President Putin doesn't worry about the financial sanctions and that he really is a military man. He only responds to that kind of might, and yet there is no appetite for it from the West.
No, because I think everybody understands what that would mean. Look, in terms of military readiness, of course we support NATO, we stand with our NATO allies. It was a Labour government who established NATO at the end of the Second World War. That's still a crucially important international alliance, and we will stand in solidarity with those countries. But nobody wants to enter into the kind of conflagration that a military fight with Russia would mean. And that's why we are talking about the maximum economic sanctions. But it is a testing time, because what he's done here is he's resurrected this old idea. As I said, if you go back to the Yalta Conference at the end of the Second World War, Stalin was telling Churchill then that Russia had a right to what he called friendly nations on its borders, i.e. ones that he controlled. This is exactly the same ideology, almost 80 years on, in the 21st century. It's out of time, it's out of date, and we must come together with democratic allies to stand against it.
Standing against him is going to cost us, isn't it, Pat? It's going to cost us dear, particularly those people who are already struggling.
It is, and it's going to mean an economic cost to those countries who implement the sanctions as well. Of course it is, but you know, for far too long we've allowed financial interests to trump national security interests, and it's through that the UK, London in particular, has become a welcome home for illicit finance, for the proceeds of looting and kleptocracy. It's not the wealth that really belongs to these oligarchs that's stored here. It's the wealth of the Russian people that's been taken from them. And for far too long, we've looked the other way and turned a blind eye to that and put the interests of finance above national security. That's got to stop now.
Far too long, you say. Do you think we were still doing it yesterday and the day before with our first tranche of so-called sanctions? Lots of people calling them tepid, and quite frankly, we should have gone harder and faster.
Look, I think President Putin was going to do what he's done overnight anyway, but I do think that sanctioning 3 people and a few small banks looks even more pathetic today than it did earlier in the week. So the government must learn from that and must step up in concert with others, with the United States, with other European countries, to inflict the maximum economic sanctions. Now, we don't need any more signals. We've seen overnight what's happening. It's pretty clear what President Putin's intentions are.
Time of crisis, how important is it to have a unified approach in the House of Commons, do you think? And I ask that because obviously there's a lot of focus again this morning in some of the papers on Labour MPs who've said some pretty disparaging things. I mean, Diane Abbott amongst them, saying this is all about the expansion of NATO. It's the fault of NATO for doing this. The NATO's destabilised the entire region.
It is not NATO who put almost 200,000 troops around the borders of Ukraine. It is not NATO who've launched the assault overnight. It is important that we stand together on this, that we stand strong with our NATO allies. That is the position of today's Labour Party. There may be some who want to blame the West for everything. They may always have held those views. They do not represent the view of Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. They don't represent the views of the Shadow Cabinet. They do not represent the views of today's Labour Party.
Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, thank you very much for your time this morning on GBNews Breakfast.
Well, stay with us here this morning. Coming up, we'll bring you the very latest on that situation in Ukraine, where that Russian-led invasion is now underway. Talks of ground incursions as well as airstrikes on some key military infrastructure in Ukraine. It's causing a huge amount of concern. A Cobra meeting is underway. The big question is now, how will the rest of the world respond? Details ahead.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Explosions across Ukraine this morning as Vladimir Putin authorises what he called a special military operation in the country.
Sirens have been heard ringing out. And as you can hear, sirens have been ringing out over the capital Kiev as locals are warned of air raids.
Morning to you, it's 9 o'clock on the 24th of February. This is Breakfast on GB News with Stephen and Isabel, and our main news today.
The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's currently holding an emergency Cobra meeting to assess the threat from Russia. In a statement, he said the Russians had launched an unprovoked attack on Ukraine.
President Biden has tweeted, "The prayers of the world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces." We'll bring you the very latest.
And as always, if you want to give us your reaction, do please get in touch this morning on the fast pace of unfolding events in Ukraine. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GBNews.
So that situation in Ukraine is causing a huge amount of international concern. There's been land movement, troops moving over the border. There have been airstrikes on that key military infrastructure in Ukraine, and now, understandably, a lot of people just trying to get out. And actually, in the last few minutes, Britain's ambassador to Ukraine has urged UK nationals to leave Ukraine immediately. It's difficult to know quite how they can do that. I mean, there had been a call, even up until yesterday, from the Foreign Secretary to say, get on commercial flights. Well, they're just not happening at the moment.
And there have been similar pleas from all of the foreign ministries, frankly, Western ones anyway. This morning, the Polish Foreign Ministry urging all Polish citizens to leave Ukraine immediately. Because as you can see from that shot on the side of the screen, the road's completely blocked getting out of Kiev. Interestingly, the German Foreign Ministry saying that if people simply cannot get out of Ukraine, that they should find a safe place and stay there. This is an escalating situation. Let's get an update from our political correspondent, Tom Harwood, on what's happening here in the UK. For the last hour and a half, the Prime Minister and his key teams have been locked in an emergency Cobra meeting discussing our response to the invasion. What more can you tell us?
They've been in the bowels of Downing Street in what Cobra actually stands for, Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. And they will have been discussing the particulars of the response, most particularly how it will be coordinated with both Washington and Brussels, how London will fit into that jigsaw as they have been wanting to move and have been moving through the whole of this week in lockstep with those Western counterparts, trying to present a united front to the Russian threat. Now, it's going to be incredibly interesting because there's domestic pressure, significant domestic pressure to go further and to go faster. So there's this two-way pull, really, between trying to work in concert with those international allies, but equally responding to that pressure, not just from the Labour Party pushing for harder and faster sanctions, but also many Conservative backbenchers who are saying much the same thing over the last 2 days as well. We're expecting a statement from the Prime Minister later today in Parliament. We don't know what time that will be. It's likely to be this afternoon. But clearly a vast response being organised as we speak.
It's very difficult, though, when you look at the situation now where President Putin doesn't seem to be overly concerned with the financial side of things, does he? He's wanting to show his political and military might. You have to question whether this is going to have any impact at all.
Absolutely, and you have to question that if further sanctions were brought on Tuesday, would that have dissuaded Vladimir Putin from doing what he has done this morning? I think it's highly unlikely. Ultimately, Putin is presenting a show of strength to the world. He is not being too dissuaded, or at least he's making a sort of a face of not being dissuaded by sanctions from the West, and of course has created such a relationship with China in particular, that economic and technological powerhouse over the last decade or so. The Chinese relationship here may well keep Russia afloat, even if the free, democratic Western world cuts it adrift.
And I was just going to say, there's hard and fast sanctions, which are inevitable now, aren't they? Let's be perfectly honest. That causes pain here. I mean, and it's going to be pain particularly for those people who are already struggling. That just seems inevitable now.
It certainly is. Russia is an oil and gas superpower. It's an energy provider that provides continental Europe with 40% of its gas. Now, the UK only imports 3% of its gas from Russia, but of course we import a lot of gas from Qatar, from America. If Europe stops importing from Russia, they'll be in direct competition with us for that gas that we buy. Those prices will go up higher than they already have gone up. Also, Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world. Everything from bread to beer may well be going up in price in response to that. Ukraine and Russia between them comprise 80% of the world's sunflower seed oil market. I mean, these are consumer goods that flow into not just people's homes, but also into businesses that provide other businesses. We're so interconnected in terms of our global economy. What happens in terms of sanctions, but also what would happen in terms of full-scale war in Ukraine will have serious economic impacts for consumers in Britain.
And Tom, we haven't had a readout of exactly who is attending Cobra, but we can assume, given the breadth of the threat, whether it be cyber to business to people's energy costs to the troops and the defence spend, it will be a broad array of ministers and also briefing advisors in there.
Certainly, in the last cabinet meeting, we saw 10 senior cabinet ministers go. That's 1/3 of the entire cabinet. Some might be saying that the cabinet should really be that size in any case, but those were the most senior people across so many different departments, really very, very broad, because of course this response affects the whole of the United Kingdom in so many different ways, as you were rightly saying there, from our energy costs to our food security to the cost of living in general, and indeed our military. Of course, we're providing support to those Baltic states. We're providing NATO with its only dedicated aircraft carrier. We're providing air support as well below Ukraine, and we have troops from Cyprus, and we've put more troops in Estonia as well. We have not put boots on the ground in Ukraine. That is a line that it looks like NATO is reluctant to cross. Of course, that would mean direct conflict between NATO and Russia. Direct conflict between two nuclear powers, something that has never happened in the history of the world. This would be a very serious step, and it's one that understandably NATO powers are holding back from at this moment.
There's so much to consider here for government. How we react immediately to this, what we want to inflict on Russia, how we want to slow this whole situation down. At what point does government also start to consider, well, how do we ease the situation for people here? When do we start looking at the fracking situation again? When do we look at scrapping the national insurance rise or green levies on energy or whatever needs to be done for those people who just can't pay for anything at the moment?
I think the chorus calling for domestic fracking to take place will be getting louder by the day. I was speaking to an oil and gas expert on my programme on GBNews yesterday who said that it should be part of our sanctions, to say that if Russia invades Ukraine, we should start our own domestic gas exploration in this country. I think that those voices will be getting louder. However, the politics of this is incredibly tricky. We know that the UK has had a moratorium on fracking since the days of Theresa May. And ultimately, there's that choice between, do we want to be an industrial power as we were in the past, or do we want to focus our sights elsewhere? I think there are so many tricky considerations for politicians to draw here. And the problem is there are no good options. Every option we have is a bad option. Every option before Boris Johnson in that Cobra meeting this morning will have been which is the least bad, what will hurt consumers and people of this country the least. Would it be sanctions or would it be the prospect of war? And how do we keep that war limited? How do we express our support for free democratic Western nations to be self-governing and sovereign? And how do we do that without spilling a drop of British blood? It is incredibly serious. Big decisions, high-stakes statesmanship, and we will be listening with interest and intent to what Boris Johnson says in the Commons later.
Yeah, Lloyd's banking group here in the UK saying they're on a heightened state of alert, guarding against expected cyber attacks. I also wanted to ask you, I've completely drawn a blank on where I was going with that point. Let you take it. This is it. I was going to say, yes, this time yesterday we were talking to the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, on the programme, and she was saying that she would welcome the cancellation, or at least the removal of the UEFA final in St Petersburg in May. Now, we've heard from UEFA this morning that that is now looking to happen, and I suppose we can't underestimate the soft power of these kinds of things, given that President Putin was waiting for the end of the Winter Olympics before he took this move. These sorts of things matter to him. That's to be broadly welcomed, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that the UK has broadly taken a united approach here. The Culture Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, indeed the opposition as well, saying that we should not be participating in cultural events held within Russia. It's interesting, ever since the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, we have known very well that Putin is someone who likes to make spectacles and likes to be respected and seen as a big player on the world stage. In fact, dictators throughout history have liked to do this, using cultural events, whether it's football matches or hosting Olympic Games. We've seen this across many authoritarian regimes over the last 100 years. These are things that they really like to do because for them it's about power projection. Everything that Putin has done in the last week is about power projection. The circus of Western chancellors, presidents and senior diplomats going one by one to Moscow to be humiliated by Vladimir Putin and his foreign minister. That has been about a power play, the long tables, the big pillared rooms, everything that Putin has done has been a show.
The situation with President Macron, who appeared weak, then appeared to be the key negotiator, now appears very weak again as a result of all of this, is extraordinary.
It is. He has been roundly played. I think there's no other way to put it. Many people were saying, well, raising an eyebrow at this sort of summit that was supposedly brokered by the French president, playing an arbitration role despite being a member of NATO. People were raising an eyebrow here. To what extent does Macron think he's this neutral arbiter in this situation? And why would Putin have fallen for it? Well, it looks like it was Macron that fell for Putin's trap, not vice versa.
Tom, I just want to talk about the pictures that people can see on their screens. And if you're listening to us on the radio, one half of our broadcast screen at the moment is taken up with a completely, 4 lanes of a motorway at a standstill. They haven't moved for a long period of time. This is people trying to get out of Kiev. We've seen all of the embassies, pretty much the Western embassies, urging citizens in the country to get out. It looks like it's incredibly difficult for people to do that. Do we have any idea how many British citizens there are and exactly what, our embassy is hoping to do? Lots of, embassies this morning saying they're moving their base from Kiev out west of the country. Might that be something that the UK does as well?
Well, of course, last week the British ambassador moved out of Kiev to a city in the west of the country. And similarly, we have had Foreign Office advice for the last few days that British citizens should have left Ukraine already. Now, there will be many people, of course, who will have not thought that this was coming so soon, who would have been listening to the sort of prevarication that we've seen with regard to those build-up of troops over the last weeks, indeed some months, around Ukraine, and thinking that this is a glacial thing. Well, suddenly we have seen a lightning war begin in Ukraine, and I imagine some who did not take the chance to leave when the Foreign Office immediately said so may well be regretting their decision now.
We've got a huge responsibility with NATO and the NATO border with Russia, and a lot of call from a lot of those countries to make sure that they are fully secure and people, countries like us, stepping up to help them out. It's interesting that the Lithuanian Parliament is looking this morning at whether they need to declare a state of emergency. Now, this just emphasises, doesn't it, how this isn't just about Ukraine anymore.
No, and it has always been about those Baltic states that feel particularly vulnerable to Russia. Of course, they are members of NATO, Lithuania, Estonia and the like, in that part of the world, countries that the UK has bolstered with troops in recent weeks as well. These countries are feeling particularly vulnerable, and the message that has come out from many in those countries, but also in Ukraine itself, is that this is not where Mr. Putin will stop. We have seen through history the way that dictators and expansionists behave. If they are given an inch, they will take a mile. If Putin thinks that he will have no response from the West by taking Ukraine, he will not stop there. It's not hard to think of allegories of times in Europe in the last 70 years where dictators took one bunch, was not halted, and then went further and went further and went further. And those Baltic states, to many in Moscow, are seen as part of that Russian sphere of influence. They see it as an insult that those Baltic states joined NATO freely of their own will, of course. They don't see them as sovereign countries. And the worry is that Putin will not stop at Ukraine. If he is not halted in Ukraine, he will go further and further.
OK, Tom, thanks very much indeed for now.
OK, let's bring in now the Foreign Affairs representative of the Belarusian opposition, that is Valery Kavalevsky. A very warm welcome to the programme, Valery. Look, we know, of course, Lukashenko has been an ally of President Putin throughout all of this. Russian troops have been in Belarus carrying out exercises in recent weeks, and we've seen this three-pronged attack into Ukraine from Belarus. What is your view on all of this in opposition to Lukashenko, your leader?
Well, in the first place, Lukashenko has made our country an aggressor state in accordance with the UN definition of aggression, allowing a second country to use territory against the third country makes us an aggressor as well. And this is absolutely unacceptable. This is appalling. This violates the constitutional provision of neutrality in Belarus, in Belarusian constitution, and it is, of course, deplorable. And as far as we're concerned, at the moment, we are calling to end all the hostilities, to stop using Belarusian territory against Ukraine. Belarus has never been in war with Ukraine, never in 1,000 history of our relations, and this situation cannot stand.
I mean, what do you understand, Valery, about what is happening in terms of incursions into Ukraine from Belarus?
As far as we know at the moment, these are only Russian forces that are moving from material difference for the Ukrainian military, of course, that they have to respond to three directions simultaneously. And also to underline here is that allowing to use the territory of Belarus against Ukraine means that we are also jeopardizing our own sovereignty and independence, since Putin looks at Belarus and Russia in the same light, and definitely that if Ukraine is under attack and under threat, this means that Belarus is also under threat as an independent state.
Valery Kavalevsky, people who are watching and listening, that is the voice of a member of the opposition in Belarus speaking to us this morning. Do you feel personally under threat? I don't know where you're speaking from when you talk about the Russian troops using your country to invade into Ukraine. I mean, what is the mood within the country? We know there's been zero tolerance of any opposition of Moscow there. Many people describing Belarus as a puppet nation.
Well, as far as the population of Belarus is concerned, there's a lot of confusion. There's not enough information. We see this in Ukraine. We see this in Belarus as well. We see that the financial markets are responding with panic to this. The fall of the Belarusian ruble against the major currencies. These are becoming the indicators of the response of the economy. As far as democratic forces are concerned, unfortunately, for a year and a half, we have been pushed out of the country, essentially forced to leave the country, and most of the democratic forces now are based in the neighboring countries, in Ukraine including, but also in Poland and Lithuania.
I mean, look, you are in a situation, as you monitor this, you are in a situation, aren't you? You've talked about the sovereignty of Belarus. I mean, you've had a soft invasion, haven't you, at the hands of President Lukashenko. In effect, you are already now part of the Russian state, aren't you?
Well, we can say that Lukashenko is under control of Putin, and this is how Russia is exercising control over Belarus. This is a serious and material threat to our independence and sovereignty, and the fact that Lukashenko not only allowed the Russian troops en masse at the border with Ukraine, but also to attack Ukraine from our territory, creates existential threat to Belarus itself.
OK, Valery Kavalevsky, Foreign Affairs Representative of the Belarusian opposition. We really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for speaking to us on the phone.
Yeah, isn't it interesting to get all these perspectives? It just shows how this is a wider concern than just Ukraine, even though, of course, it's one of the biggest countries in Europe, a population of 45 million, yet that's just not enough to stop President Putin, so it would seem. Stay with us. We'll bring you all the very latest developments in just a couple of minutes.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Time is 9:22. Been giving breaking coverage throughout the course of the morning on that invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Let's get some more analysis from Will Geddes, who's been with us throughout this morning. Look, really fast-paced, moving developments, quite frankly. We've been looking at air raids playing not only in Kiev and Kharkiv, but now we're also hearing in some Polish border towns, which does raise the concern, of course, about whether or not at some point there could be a threat to NATO countries.
And I think there will be. I hate to be a doomsday, spokesperson, but we've heard Lithuania's gone to a state of emergency. Things are happening on the border of Poland. I think we're going to see a bit of a domino effect across many of these countries that are on proximity or certainly on the borders of Russia. And I think people are readying themselves. So it's going to be absolutely essential. I think, if anything, for Prime Minister Johnson, it's going to be what he says that comes out of this Cobra meeting that will either be the most important aspect of what our footing will be going forward. And if he's not robust enough, I think Putin's just going to feel, yeah, he can continue.
But if a single toe crosses the line into a NATO country or a single bullet crosses the border, that's Putin, in effect, inviting all of NATO to come knocking on his doorstep.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I mean, quite literally, with guns out. I mean, that's crazy.
It is. But when we bear in mind that NATO has to mobilise, and although they've been readying themselves, and their normal mobilisation period, particularly for their quick reaction forces, is about 2 weeks, and they've expedited that to a week, he has a head start. And the question is that with Putin, unless NATO are readied and they're in the right positions, they're mobilized and they're good to go, then Putin could cause irreparable damage before anything particularly happens. But then it's going to be down to NATO to decide what they're going to do. And at the moment, they're appearing somewhat toothless. So it's concerning.
Yeah, look, we're waiting to hear the outcome of this Cobra meeting that's been going on now for nearly 2 hours. We're hearing in the last few moments that the Prime Minister will address the nation today on this issue. The German Foreign Minister describing it as a day of infamy, that he'd woken up into a different world this morning. And just a few moments ago, we spoke to an opponent, Foreign Minister in the Shadow Cabinet, or the Shadow Office in Belarus, opposing Lukashenko. Well, Lukashenko in the last few seconds has come out and saying they will stand by Russia, offering Belarusian troops and will take part in any conflict if needed.